Arthur Schopenhauer is basically known for two things. First, he's quite possibly the most important influence on Friedrich Nietzsche, which is why we're talking about him on the Nietzsche podcast. But secondly, he's known for being the quintessential pessimist. Schopenhauer argues that life and existence are futile, that there is no good served in all of the strivings of the human will, and that the best thing for us is to negate the will. The negation of all desires and goals, and yes, even the rejection of the world, because this is a world of untold and unimaginable suffering, an inevitable fact of our existence in it. So, those two things that everyone seems to know about Schopenhauer, nevertheless may present something of a puzzle because Nietzsche couldn't be more opposed to such an outlook on life, to such a picture of the world. And yet, Schopenhauer had arguably more influence in shaping the early philosophy of Nietzsche than any other thinker. Why would it be the case that a Schopenhauer, who rejects life and rejects the world, could give rise to a Nietzsche, the man who says that we must love our fate, say yes to life, and indeed wish for our lives to return to us endlessly, unchanged in any form or fashion? To answer this question and to untangle this puzzle, how the no-saying Schopenhauer influenced the yes-saying Nietzsche, we're going to do a sort of introductory course to Schopenhauer's philosophy. And then we'll bring in Nietzsche's writings on Schopenhauer and Nietzsche as he relates to Schopenhauer in the episodes to follow. This first episode of 2 will concern Schopenhauer's twin explanations of the world, which are interrelated, and Schopenhauer would argue depend upon one another, require and assert one another. There's the way of viewing the world as will, and the way of viewing the world as representation. In one sense, the world is an undivided, unchanging force which Schopenhauer calls will, which is the true nature of all phenomena that arise. They're all just objectifications of the will, which is in itself just blind impulse. But on the other hand, the will takes on these different manifestations, or objectifications, that are recognizable and distinct from one another, which arise and pass away, and are thus temporary. In short, the world of representation, in this world, things are subject to causality, to temporality, to the laws of space and laws of physics and the laws that govern matter, and thus all things are born, grow, and die. This is the world of representation, because this world, as far as we perceive it, only exists as a representation in the minds of men, and there's no way to talk about it outside of that context. So this episode is about the theory behind Schopenhauer's philosophical approach. We're talking about why it is that Schopenhauer argues that there are these two ways of viewing the world and what they entail, and how he grounds his arguments that follow in the latter half of the book, which is about his practical philosophy. And so the episode after this one will talk about his practical philosophy, which means his ethics and his aesthetic ideas. So the episode today will cover books 1 and 2 of World as Will and Representation, which is Schopenhauer's, really his only book. He wrote a lot of essays and fragments and aphorisms and elaborations on that book, but his whole work is centered around that single book. And so we're covering books 1 and 2 of that, which is what it concerns what Schopenhauer would call the objective picture of the world, his epistemology and his ontology. The next episode will be Schopenhauer's normative ideas for living in that world, and we'll cover books 3 and 4. But first, we'll talk a little bit about Schopenhauer's life. Unlike many other German philosophers who came from families of either academics or clergy, Schopenhauer came from a family of the merchant class. His father was a respected businessman who settled the family in Danzig. The city was later taken over by the Prussians, and Schopenhauer's father moved the family to Hamburg. The family lived there for 12 years, but Schopenhauer's father eventually began to show signs of mental unbalance and died by falling into a canal one night in an incident that most regarded as likely being a suicide. This left the young Arthur Schopenhauer with only his mother and his sister, and Schopenhauer's relationship with his mother, Johanna, has been much commented on, but suffice to say they did not seem to like one another. Their correspondence and some of their interactions that have survived gives an image of a very hostile and sometimes nasty relationship, to say the least. So, for example, Schopenhauer's mother wrote novels which were moderately popular at the time, and he allegedly told her that one day his writing would still be available when her books had been long forgotten, and his mother responded something to the effect of, if I remember correctly, she said, yes, I'm sure the one book you wrote will be available, but will anyone still care, After his father died, young Arthur, at 17 years old, kept a promise he'd made to go into the business world. And so the family home was sold. His mother and sister left Arthur for Weimar. Arthur, as the inheritor of the Schopenhauer name, was consigned to working at an office as a clerk. And the office was run by a merchant named Jenisch, or Jenisch, I guess. This was an arrangement that Schopenhauer's father set up for him before his father died an untimely death. And now, sort of in the wake of his father's death, Arthur Schopenhauer had little choice but to continue on that course until he was 21 years of age, which was the point where he would inherit his share of the family fortune, or at least whatever was left of it that his mother hadn't spent. His mother was living off this inheritance as an independently wealthy person, and doing all of her creative pursuits in the meanwhile. And so the prospect of these 4 long years as a clerk were like torture to Arthur Schopenhauer, who he had studied in Paris. He had dreams of a literary career. And so 2 years into his time working for Jenisch, he received a letter from his mother saying that if he wanted to, he could regard his promise to his late father fulfilled and could change his way of living if he so desired. Upon reading this letter, Schopenhauer burst into tears and immediately walked out of the office. Schopenhauer then went into higher education. He studied at Goethe in grammar school, and then at Weimar. And then he enters Göttingen University, where he studies medicine and science. He was around 22 at the time. A teacher of his named G.E. Schulze told him that he should limit his reading of philosophy to Plato and Kant. Schopenhauer took this advice more or less literally, and as we will discuss, you can see the effect that this had on Schopenhauer's philosophy. At a very early age, his philosophical ideas became relatively fixed, such that his philosophy did not develop at all beyond the initial ideas set forth in his book, World as Will and Representation. For the latter 2/3 of his life, of his whole 72 years on Earth, he more or less held to the same ideas. He wrote that book at 28 years old, and for the rest of his years on the planet, everything he wrote was just an elaboration on the same set of ideas. And so, as such, we cannot really say that he was influenced all that much by contemporary philosophers, including some famous philosophers that he saw lecture in person, such as Fichte, because he'd already made up his mind on the core ideas. Meanwhile, he saw himself as the only legitimate interpreter and inheritor of the philosophy of Kant, and overall despised all others who claimed to be continuing Kantianism. This included Hegel, whom Schopenhauer especially hated. So he publishes his book, World as Will and Representation, in 1918, and 2 years later, he went to go lecture at university. He opened a course in Berlin for the summer semester, and he chose a lecture time at the same day and same time that Hegel lectured. Hegel at the time was a philosophical rock star, and he was very popular as a lecturer, to loads of people coming to his lectures. Schopenhauer was basically unknown at the time and lectured mostly to empty rooms. So he tried for years, or for months rather, sorry, not years. He tried for months in vain to compete with Hegel, but he eventually gave up and he stopped teaching the course. Schopenhauer's philosophical grounding in Western philosophy seemed to be fixed within the world of Plato and Kant, without any possibility of being influenced by his contemporaries. But there was a third element, which came from outside the Western philosophical tradition. For the first time, translations of some of the ideas of Indian philosophy, including Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, were coming into the Western world through translations that had never before been widely available. Schopenhauer read some of these imports, and this became the third pillar of his philosophical structure. Specifically, the text that contributed the most to the views put forward in World of As Will and Representation was the Upanishads, of which he had a Latin translation of a Persian translation of the Sanskrit original, and this translation first appeared in 1801. By combining Plato and Kant and then adding the influence of the Upanishads, Schopenhauer forged a new philosophical identity, and he was certain he would eventually come into fame and repute. However, as with his lectures failing to find an audience at Berlin, Schopenhauer also failed to find a readership for his book, and it was mostly unknown and obscure up until the 1850s, when Schopenhauer had become an old man. And in that decade, he did gain some disciples in his later years. And because he got that taste, fame became like a manic obsession for him. Nevertheless, during his lifetime, the philosophical direction set by Hegel remained the dominant direction within German philosophy, and Schopenhauer remained pretty obscure. What else? Well, there's a couple of fun stories about Schopenhauer, using fun in a darkly humorous way, because everything's going to be a little bit dark today. He pushed a woman down the stairs during an argument, or they fought and she fell down the stairs, however it happened. But Schopenhauer then fought against her litigation against him. She sued him for damages that he owed her by causing her a lifelong injury. And he fought 5 years of legal battles not to have to pay this woman anything. And eventually, the court ruled that he did have to provide her with $60 a year, which is, in today's money, nearest as I can figure it, about 85 US dollars. I got that figure because Hollingdale, he gives that amount as about, I think he says 9 pounds or 15 pounds. I can't remember how much it was. Some small amount of pounds in 1970 England, which is when the work that I was reading off of was published, was in 1970 England. So I did a little conversion to modern day US dollars, adjusting for exchange rate and inflation. Got about 85 US dollars. So maybe that's accurate, maybe it's not. If it's not, let me know. In any case, not a lot of money. Whatever amount we're talking about, not a lot of money that Schopenhauer had to pay this woman. But he just hated that he had to pay her anything. And when the woman finally died in 1852, Schopenhauer received her death certificate, and he wrote on it, obit onus, abit onus, which is Latin for, the old woman dies, the debt departs. Another fun story, Schopenhauer, when there was some civil unrest and rioting and socialist uprisings going on, at one point he went and he volunteered his apartment for the soldiers to use to get a better shot at the rioters. He didn't just consent to soldiers using his balcony. He went down and opened the door and let them in and said, come on, you can get a good shot at them from up here. These stories are often brought up because they're outlandish. They also show a dark side to Schopenhauer. But there's underneath a lot of the stories of Schopenhauer's life, what we learn is a sort of stubbornness of character, obstinance, unwillingness to bend toward, for any reason or to anybody. And so R.J. Hollingdale, in his introduction to Schopenhauer's essays, he writes about Schopenhauer's daily habits, specifically about his daily habits during the twilight years of Schopenhauer's life. And so just as we talked about Nietzsche's daily habits in the second episode, I think it's always illuminating to read about the day-to-day life of these figures because it tells you so much about them. So Hollingdale writes, quote, from the age of 45 until his death 27 years later, Schopenhauer lived in Frankfurt am Main. He lived alone, in rooms, and every day of 27 years he followed an identical routine. He rose every morning at 7 and had a bath but no breakfast. He drank a cup of strong coffee before sitting down at his desk and writing until noon. At noon he ceased work for the day and spent half an hour practicing the flute, on which he became quite a skilled performer. Then he went out for lunch at the Englischerhof. After lunch, he returned home and read until 4, when he left for his daily walk. He walked for 2 hours, no matter what the weather. At 6 o'clock, he visited the reading room of the library and read the Times. In the evening, he attended the theater or a concert, after which he had dinner at a hotel or restaurant. He got back home between 9 and 10 and went early to bed. He was willing to deviate from this routine in order to receive visitors, but with this exception, he carried on through for 27 years. End quote. Hollingdale's conclusion from this is that this immovability is the central facet of Schopenhauer's personality. He didn't walk every day because he was a health nut. We see no other evidence of health fanaticism in Schopenhauer's behavior. It's simply that he demanded that he keep to his routine every single day, come whatever weather, and nothing would stop him. And what's interesting is that we also hear this about Nietzsche and his daily walk, and also the people of Königsberg used to set their clocks by the regularity of when Kant went on his walk. Among all these German philosophers, we find this exceptional regularity with their daily habits, and always a quintessential walk. So it's strange to me in a way. In some sense it makes perfect sense, but these figures don't just share ideas, they share habits and certain patterns in their lives. So in any case, Nietzsche first discovered Schopenhauer from a friend named Paul Deussen, who recommended that he read World as Will in Representation while the two were fellow students at Schulpforte, which is a renowned German boarding school that Nietzsche went to before he would go on to college, what we would call college in the U.S. Deussen went on to become a noted Orientalist thinker and an explicator of Eastern philosophical concepts, and a respected writer in his own right. But he's really important to us in our story because he's the one who showed Nietzsche Schopenhauer. Nietzsche, in the words of Charlie Huneman, was, quote, lit afire by Schopenhauer. He'd become, very familiar with Plato and Greek philosophy generally. And Nietzsche, like Schopenhauer, was very influenced in his thinking by Kantianism, especially the neo-Kantians that we've discussed, such as Friedrich Albert Lange, Hermann von Helmholtz. You can learn more about that neo-Kantian influence on Nietzsche in episodes 5 and 8 of this podcast, the ones on Heraclitus and on truth, respectively. But Nietzsche took that initial spark set by Schopenhauer, and he went in a radically different direction than Deussen. Rather than leading Nietzsche to the embrace of Eastern philosophical concepts, the fact that Schopenhauer had so successfully blended and drawn parallels between the ideas of Kant and the ideas of the Hindus and the Buddhists indicated something to Nietzsche about the parallels between Christian values and the values of the Buddhists. Furthermore, Schopenhauer had dared to take the fundamental metaphysical ideas of the West and of our religious background, which Kant had translated into philosophical terms. Schopenhauer had taken these fundamental ideas and followed them through to their final and necessary conclusion in an honest and fearless way. And Schopenhauer ultimately produces a philosophy which rejects the world and rejects all life. He had done this in his own eyes by fulfilling the Kantian metaphysics, by fulfilling the Kantian morality, all of which arguably began with Plato and his ideas of the cave, of the true world remaining unattainable to the senses, of reason providing the power to see through the veils of illusion. So, in short, Schopenhauer provided the insight Nietzsche required in order to see through all the flaws, as he saw them, inherent in the Western philosophical tradition, and within the strands of thought begun with the likes of Plato and later continued with Kant. If Schopenhauer is, in fact, thinking through the ideas of Kant and Plato to their logical conclusions, then Schopenhauer's honesty in this respect led him to this place of pessimism. Nietzsche wished to fully embrace that honesty and to dare to ask those hard and terrifying questions about reality that Schopenhauer raised, such as, is life worth living? Or, suppose that to not exist would be better than to come into being in this world of suffering. Where Nietzsche then departs from Schopenhauer is it's in several ways, but one of the big ways is in his metaphysical shift, which we discussed in the very first episode. in Nietzsche placing all the value into this world of phenomena and embracing the world of phenomena on that basis. He accepts this is a world of striving and suffering, but then seeks to affirm that world. And we'll get into all of this much more in the later episodes when we talk about how Nietzsche dealt with Schopenhauer and how he moved beyond Schopenhauer. But I hope I've given you at least a somewhat comprehensible account of Schopenhauer's overall life and significance, and what his significance to Nietzsche more than anything. And so that, with all that being said, let's go to the text now. Schopenhauer's great work, The World as Will and Representation, and I'm using the E.F.J. Payne translation. Where I'd like to begin talking about Schopenhauer's actual philosophy is with The World as Will, which actually is the topic of the second book. Schopenhauer, he actually begins by talking about the world as representation first, but I'm going to reverse the order because I think his thinking and his method when talking about the world as will is a bit easier to get or to make it click upon hearing a lot of this for the first time. So book 2 begins with Schopenhauer illustrating why it is that the world exists in these two aspects of will and representation. And his means of doing this is by turning our attention to the subjective experience. Specifically, he centers our focus on our own consciousness, our own awareness, and on our own bodies. This observation, I believe, is the most profound among the first two books. It's the observation that the world as we know it exists in two aspects because one's subjective experience exists in two aspects as well. Schopenhauer draws our attention to our own subjective experience, and particularly he says that the subjective experience that we human beings have of our own body is in these two aspects. On the one hand, we're aware of our bodies as they exist in the form of objects. This is the body as a representation. Schopenhauer operates within that framework laid down by Kant, that all things we perceive come to us through the sense organs, and thus we do not experience reality as it actually is, but merely reality as the sense organs represent it to us. One's body is clearly an object within the world of objects, and it's affected by other objects. It's subject to the laws of physics that all the other phenomena have to obey. That means the body is subject to impermanence, to causality, to impenetrability by other objects made of matter. Not that the matter that makes you up can't be pierced or penetrated, but that, when you place your hand on the table, it doesn't pass through the table. Like other solid objects, you don't merely pass through things. You're not coterminous with other objects with mass. You exist as a body that moves through time and space and occupies time and space like other objects, and this body is part of the world of matter, obeying the laws that govern matter. And you, as the knowing subject, perceive your body as a thing in that respect. And yet, you also have a different experience with the body, or a different aspect of your own experience. This subjective experience is unique to contemplating the body, and that it is the experience of having control over the body, that you don't have that experience with any other phenomena you contemplate. And more than that, Schopenhauer argues that what it is that you are is coterminous with the body insofar as what you are is will. So what he means by will is approximate to the subjective experience you have in acting as a subject in the world. What your will wills, you might say, so the body does. The body enacts your will in the world, and thus the body is the objectification of your will in the world. And so what you are, in one sense, is that representation, but this explanation on its own is a little more than a tautology, right? Because we can't say that your sense organs themselves are simply a creation of your sense organs. That, whatever the subject is that senses, the thing that senses, is not itself a product of the senses. Whatever it is that represents is not itself reducible to a representation. What are you in and of yourself that is not simply a representation? And again, the answer is will for Schopenhauer. I think the argument here is very strong, and that Schopenhauer's evidence for this, it's the subjective experience that everyone has, that we experience ourselves within the world as a thing moving towards a series of goals and desires. And these goals and desires are not autonomously selected, but an inextricable part of who you are and what is in your own nature, such that you hunger, and so your will becomes aimed at finding food and eating, and the body follows suit. Or you have a sexual desire, and your will becomes aimed at fulfilling that impulse, or you have a desire for status or material advantage, whatever it might be. When you desire to act on this will, the body is the thing that acts, and it does so in a way that Schopenhauer argues, agree with him or not on this, he says it's not even a causal link. The will is so fundamental that it exists independently of causality, because causality is simply a law of how phenomena behave. And the will in itself is not a phenomenon, because phenomena are things within this world of representation. Whatever is governed by causality is an object within that world of representation. So we cannot apply causality to the will in Schopenhauer's view. Instead, the will is this groundless ground of all phenomena. And so he writes in section 17 of book 2, quote, "We ask whether this world is nothing more than representation. In that case, it would inevitably pass us by like an empty dream, or a ghostly vision not worth our consideration. Or we ask whether it is something else, something in addition, and if so, what that something is. This much is certain, namely that this something about which we are inquiring must be by its whole nature completely and fundamentally different from the representation, and so the forms and laws of the representation must be wholly foreign to it." End quote. So again, this something is the will, which Schopenhauer argues is more fundamental. It's a more fundamental experience than consciousness or sentience or intelligence, however you want to call it, because clearly life can exist without that. Different animals, different forms of life can have different levels or types of intellect. Human beings can have different linguistic frames for interpreting the world, different concepts, but we all have a will. Animals exist which likely have no conceptual framework, very limited, but they still apparently have a will. The sine qua non of being is that you have a certain nature which strives towards certain ends. And Schopenhauer argues as a human being, we all have that subjective experience of being a willing being, of having a will. And that's an inner experience we all have, and have only for ourselves. Since you are yourself a phenomenon, your experience of the will is direct knowledge of the inner nature of a phenomenon, of yourself as that phenomenon. And thus, where the Kantian argument is that we only know the world of objects through representations and we can know nothing of the inner contents, in Schopenhauer's argument, well, you have direct knowledge of the inner contents of you. And what we find when we look there is will. And Schopenhauer therefore uses this term to describe the inner nature of the true world, what we'll call the thing in itself. And so, you have the thing as it appears, and then you have the thing in itself, the thing as it really is. And this is because he believes that the thing in itself, as the groundless ground of being, must be universal and indivisible. That means that any insight into the thing in itself, the true world, must hold everywhere and always. In Book 2, Section 19, he writes, quote, "Something in the consciousness of everyone distinguishes the representation of his own body from all others that are, in other respects, quite like it. That is that the body occurs in consciousness in quite another way, toto genere different, that is denoted by the word will. It is just this double knowledge of our own body which gives us information about that body itself, about its action and movement following on motives, as well as about its suffering through outside impressions. In a word, about what it is, not as a representation, but as something over and above this, and hence what it is in itself." End quote. And so Schopenhauer says, through this insight of the body existing for us both as our will and as a representation, we can understand the nature of all things in the world. Phenomena as we experience them are our own representation of the world to ourselves, through our sense organs, and then through assigning them a conceptual understanding. But what lies beneath all things is will, a certain nature, striving towards a certain end. If this is too abstract for you, Schopenhauer writes in section 21 of Book 2, building on these ideas, that we have an immediate knowledge of this, not just in abstract terms, but in concrete terms. This is in the form of feeling. Feeling is the manifestation of the will within the body. He writes that feeling, quote, makes itself known in an immediate way in which subject and object are not quite clearly distinguished, yet it becomes known to the individual himself not as a whole, but only in its particular acts, end quote. And so, body and its feelings, these are for Schopenhauer the entry point for understanding the thing in itself. And to expand on why a little more, drawing on Indian philosophy, Schopenhauer holds the thing in itself to be non-dualistic. Dualism in this context means the idea that separate things can exist independently of one another, which means that there's such a thing as both being and non-being, that you can thus have many distinct beings which are separate entities. But these propositions all require us to presuppose things such as space, time, matter, and therefore causality, duration, impermanence, temporality, and so on. But these are all representations, or they all obtain only in the world of representation. None of these are known to us. None of these laws I just listed, or traits of objects that exist, none of these are known through direct experience of the inner content of the world. These are laws governing how phenomena behave and interact, how objects exist, not how the reality, which is the foundation for those things, behaves. It doesn't ever escape from the world as it appears. And so Schopenhauer argues that we've recognized, after we've recognized the will as the thing in itself, we can proceed to recognize it in all things, knowing it in a sort of intuitive sense on the basis that we have an experiential knowledge, a direct and experiential knowledge of the inner contents of the world from within ourselves. And so dualistic, the laws that govern dualism, that applies in the world of phenomena. To Schopenhauer, all of these laws that establish separateness and distinctness wouldn't apply in the world as well, in the world in and of itself. So I'm going to read a long passage now, where we get a better idea, we get the transference of this concept of the will as the thing in itself to all sorts of processes and even inanimate things in nature, such as crystals and the process by which they form. We also get Schopenhauer's reasoning for why he chose to call everything a manifestation of will and didn't use some other term. And so we're going to be reading again from section 21. Quote, "The reader who with me has gained this conviction will find that of itself it will become key to the knowledge of the innermost being of the whole of nature, since he now transfers it to all phenomena that are given to him, not like his own phenomenon, both in direct and indirect knowledge, but in the latter solely, and hence merely in a one-sided way, as representation alone. He will recognize that same will, not only in those phenomena that are quite similar to his own, in men and animals, as their inmost nature, but continued reflection will lead him to recognize that force that shoots and vegetates in the plant, indeed, the force by which the crystal is formed, the force that turns the magnet to the North Pole, the force whose shock he encounters from the contact of metals of different kinds, the force that appears in the elective affinities of matter as repulsion and attraction, separation and union, and finally even gravitation, which acts so powerfully in all matter, pulling the stone to the earth and the earth to the sun. All these he will recognize as different only in the phenomenon, but the same according to their inner nature. He will recognize them all as that which is immediately known to him so intimately and better than everything else, and where it appears most distinctly is called will. It is only this application of reflection which no longer lets us stop at the phenomenon, but leads us on to the thing in itself. All representation, be it of whatever kind it may, all object is phenomenon, but only the will is thing in itself. As such, it is not representation at all, but toto genere, different therefrom. It is that of which all representation, all object is the phenomenon, the visibility, the objectivity. It is the innermost essence, the kernel of every particular thing, and also of the whole. It appears in every blindly acting force of nature, and also in the deliberate conduct of man, and the great difference between the two concerns only the degree of the manifestation, not the inner nature of what is manifested." End quote. So, I think that clarifies a lot of this. To clarify the last sentence there, actually, there's no more will in the human being than in, say, the crystal or the stone or the animal, even though the human is a more complex phenomenon. The will is, for Schopenhauer, everywhere and always the same, and indivisible. It's very similar to concepts in Indian philosophy like the Atman in that respect. Physical reality is not separate and not separable from this single essence which cannot be divided from itself at any point. It only divides into different representations within the world of appearances, but as he says actually later on in Book 3, which we'll cover next week, that if we agree with Plato, this world of appearances is simply a dreamlike reality in which all things eventually pass away. He likens the world of representation to being more like a dream than the world as pure will, which is the real character of the world. And so the will is equally distributed everywhere. It is the background substance of all being, just as much in man as in animals or plants. And Schopenhauer even includes forces such as magnetism in his description of things that are simply objectifications of the will. So, why the term will, aside from the explanation he's already given? Why not make up a new term rather than choose a term like will, which might carry connotative or cultural baggage? Well, Schopenhauer says we have to borrow from the lexicon of familiar things in order to name the thing in itself, even though the thing in itself is not correlated with anything in particular. And the best word to choose is derived from man's will, because this is our term for the only direct experience we have with the thing in itself, which is our own inner experience. The name is chosen because, quote, "the direct knowledge of which lies nearest to us and leads to the indirect knowledge of all others," end quote. So Schopenhauer suggests that coming up with a new word would only be appropriate for something truly and purely in the abstract, something for which the facts are only inferred and never directly experienced. But our direct experience does exist, and it's through the will. And so Schopenhauer, he also justifies his choice of the word will with the term force, which he could have chosen. And personally, I think that would have been a fine word to use. But the problem Schopenhauer has is much the same as the issue he has with inventing a new word. Force is too abstract, he says. He says, quote, "If we refer to the concept of force to that of will, we have in fact referred something more unknown to something infinitely better known, indeed to the one thing really known to us immediately and completely," end quote. So his argument is that we add really nothing explanatory by calling the thing in itself a force, or designating it as force. Will is something that we understand, that we experience in our desires and in our emotions. We haven't expanded the meaning by calling it force instead. The concept would remain abstract. But consider it the other way around, which is what Schopenhauer actually does. We can understand what a force is through the concept of will, in Schopenhauer's view at least. We actually do add new understanding to the concept of force. That is, understanding what a force might be as the thing in itself. Force as such, by reflecting on and meditating upon our own experience of having a will and acting upon the world in accord with that will, we might gain an understanding of what a force is. And so we don't gain anything by calling it the world as force instead of the world as will, but the other way around does add something. And now, I think Schopenhauer is correct here. The word will does give additional meaning. Whether or not he's correct that what a force is actually, comparable to the subjective experience of the will, whether you find that compelling or not, that is the argument he's making. I watched a conversation about Schopenhauer between Brian McGee and Frederick Copleston while I was doing research for this episode. And McGee wished that Schopenhauer utilized the term energy, and he suggested that physicists of the modern day have come to something similar to this understanding. Copleston argued back that energy is a good term, but only for like the fundamental nature of the phenomenal world, right? The world of representation, not for the noumenon. And I think McGee actually might have not really understood the phenomena-noumena split, which a lot of people don't, even very intelligent people. But Copleston was keen to point out Schopenhauer really believed he was breaking through to the noumenon, to the world in itself, by drawing on our intuitive understanding of the will. This is an ontological claim. Schopenhauer is actually not talking about what we would call energy. He's literally talking about will as the fundamental nature of reality. And so Copleston questions, as I'm sure many of you are doing, whether Schopenhauer really broke through to the thing in itself, in so many words. And Copleston said he defers more to Kant and thinks this phenomena-noumena split or divide remains pretty firm. And Nietzsche might actually agree with this assessment, in my view. But I hope what I've conveyed here might help to explain how Schopenhauer was doing philosophy in a way that appealed to Nietzsche, in that he's beginning from himself and his own consciousness, his own awareness, his own immediate certainties in order to philosophize. And so Schopenhauer is rather like Descartes in that respect. He's counseling the subject who's reading along with him. Go back to the foundations of what the individual knows for himself by direct experience. But where Descartes found thought as the fundamental subjective experience, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, notice that Schopenhauer instructs us to look instead to something different: feeling, desire, want. In a word, the passions. This is the gateway to understanding the fundamental reality. Not intellect or thoughts, but passions. And ultimately, he's only using these passions to indicate something even more fundamental, because the term will is only an approximation, right? So this is the starting point of the Schopenhauerian philosophical approach. Look to yourself, to your immediate certainties within your subjective experience. We all have these objects which we represent to ourselves, which is only seeing the outside, what is superficial to the object. But we have this one object, which we can see the inside of, which is our own body. And what we find on the inside of the body exists within all phenomena, because all phenomena are the objectification of a reality which is not itself divided or distinct or different. It's not itself an object. It's not objectified. Now, one might ask at this point what it really means to say that everything is merely will. Why shouldn't we simply follow the scientific method to determine the true character of what reality is? Again, that's the same problem with the understanding of McGee, where he's talking with Copleston. To this, I would simply say, no amount of science can ever break us out of the limitations of empiricism. The world as we know it, we receive through the senses. Schopenhauer accepted this fully and believed that the only way we could thus posit anything about the world as such is through reason. And this is by making those synthetic judgments a priori that we discussed in episode 16, the episode on the congenital defect of philosophers. And so as a refresher, these are conclusions one can draw which provides new information strictly through the investigation of logical concepts, strictly through applying reason to those concepts which we know to be true and extrapolating conclusions by those means. So what Schopenhauer is doing here, or at least this is his attempt, the use of reason to leap over the phenomena-noumena chasm, and notice his project, when we take a step back and look at it in the grand scheme of things, it's the same thing that we see of going all the way back to the pre-Platonic philosophers. You might call to mind the definition that Nietzsche gave in those lectures about who the philosopher is and what the philosopher does. Philosophy is the art of representing universal existence in terms of abstract concepts. And that's what Schopenhauer's doing. His attempt is to provide an explanation for universal existence. His major problem to overcome is that Western philosophy had become obsessed and had this fixation on how we only know the outer appearance of existence and not its inner character. And so this is the first task which he must solve, at least for himself, by drawing on what he knows subjectively to be the inner character of existence. And so another phenomena to consider is the animals. From all accounts, animals act without representations. They don't have the kinds of sophisticated minds that we have. Rather, they engage in blind activity with no representation of the object of their goal. Whether animals actually have representations or not is beside the point to Schopenhauer, because he says they act as though motive is unknown to them. They act as though they have no conceptual understanding. So if they don't live in this world of representation, at least not to the degree that we do, that isn't to say animals don't have knowledge, but what they have is what we'll call direct knowledge, right? It's not intellectual or abstract knowledge. The animal thus shows how the will works even without the aid of representation. The faculty of representation is not necessary for the will's activity. In fact, in most phenomena, there's no awareness or self-awareness of the will at all. It is simply a blind striving. That would be the case with gravity, for example. Schopenhauer argues that gravity, like all forces or laws that we perceive in nature, represents the will in its blindest form of striving, which is distributed in all things with mass, and is simply this tendency, this will for large objects with mass to accumulate more mass to themselves. Gravity acts as a force and a constraint in all phenomena as they in turn will themselves to exist. And so gravity tries to constrain all things with mass, and then these things in mass with mass, emerge, such as animals which strive not to be constrained. Schopenhauer prefigures Nietzsche in characterizing the driving force behind the actions of all things as blind causes rather than conscious motives. And he even extends this to mankind. He sources these causes to the nerves and to external stimuli. He writes in Book 2, Section 23, quote, "All that occurs in the body must occur through will. Through here this will is not guided by knowledge, not determined according to motives, but acts blindly according to causes, called in this case stimuli," end quote. And so he then discusses at length in the same passage why stimuli shape the existence of all living things, and his final step is to account for things even without organs, without nervous systems, and without physiology. These are things without any receptivity to stimulus, without any motive or knowledge at all. And so that includes phenomena like we talked about before, like the law of gravity. He also lists, quote, "the powerful, irresistible impulse with which masses of water rush downwards," end quote. Or, quote, "let us look at the crystal being rapidly and suddenly formed with such regularity of configuration. It is obvious that this is only a perfectly definite and precisely determined striving in different directions constrained and held firm by coagulation," end quote. And so the reason for bringing all this up, this link between mankind and the animals and blind forces, is that further in the same passage, still in 23, here Schopenhauer lays it out explicitly that what we do as beings that exist in the light of knowledge is fundamentally the same activity that all the objectified forms of the will engage in. He writes, quote, "Let us observe the choice with which bodies repel and attract one another, unite and separate, when set free in the fluid state and released from bonds of rigidity. Finally, we feel directly and immediately how a burden which hampers our body by its gravitation towards the earth increasingly presses and squeezes this body in pursuit of its one tendency. If we observe all this, it will not cost us a great effort of the imagination to recognize once more our own inner nature, even at so great a distance. It is that which in us pursues its ends by the light of knowledge, but here, in the feeblest of phenomena, only strives blindly in a dull, one-sided, and unalterable manner," end quote. So, I know at this point the dire materialists among the audience are probably still fairly perplexed or frustrated. Why regard the world as will, except in perhaps a poetic manner? The materialist is probably still waiting on some material evidence that he can use to explain the material world, tautological as that is. Or perhaps, the modern materialist even realizes the hopelessness of such an endeavor and has abandoned the very pursuit of providing a universal explanation for existence in the form of concepts. And to this type of person, I will employ the rhetoric of appealing to them along the conceptual lines they're probably more comfortable with, by pointing out that Schopenhauer is, in a sense, operating from a very skeptical stance here, rather than a stance of credulity, even though it perhaps might not seem like it. And perhaps Schopenhauer is even being more skeptical than the average materialists are being. And to explain why this is, we'll go back into Schopenhauer's Epistemology, which is largely the subject of the first book, the part which is most heavily indebted to Kant, although Kant's influence is all over the whole work. And Kant is generally known for attempting to salvage many of our metaphysical or moral prejudices through the use of rigorous logic. But we also have to recognize that Kant wrote a text critiquing reason and delimiting the boundaries of what reason could explain. Much of Kant's contribution to philosophy is actually in more rigorously laying out what logic cannot do. And Schopenhauer is right alongside him in that. And so Schopenhauer provides a more straightforward version of Kant's arguments, which is not a hard thing to do, to be more straightforward than Kant. But he provides a more straightforward version of Kant's arguments and the limitations of reason, contrasted with what we do have sufficient reason to believe. And Schopenhauer sums up this whole post-Kantian epistemology as follows, and this is in section 1 at the very beginning of the whole book, quote, "No truth is more certain, more independent of all others than this, namely that everything that exists for knowledge, and hence the whole of this world, is only object in relation to the subject, perception of the perceiver, in a word, representation. Naturally, this holds good to the present as well as of the past and future, of what is remotest as well as what is nearest, for it holds good of time and space themselves, in which alone all these distinctions arise. Everything that in any way belongs and can belong to the world is inevitably associated with this being conditioned by the subject, and it exists only for the subject. The world is representation." End quote. Schopenhauer then quotes in the same section Sir William Jones from the book On the Philosophy of the Asiatics, which establishes this attempt of Schopenhauer's to syncretize Kantianism with Indian philosophy, which makes Schopenhauer so interesting to me. So Schopenhauer quotes Jones as follows, quote, "The fundamental tenet of the Vedanta school consisted not in denying the existence of matter, that is, of solidity, impenetrability, and extended figure, to deny which would be lunacy, but in correcting the popular notion of it, and in contending that it has no essence independent of mental perception, that existence and perceptibility are convertible terms," end quote. And Schopenhauer's comment on that quotation we just read is, quote, "These words adequately express the compatibility of empirical reality with transcendental reality," end quote. And that's the Kantian masterstroke of epistemology, right? And Schopenhauer puts it into such easy-to-understand terms. There's some kind of transcendental reality behind the senses, which we can't have direct knowledge of, but we can know that it exists. It transcends what we can glean through empirical sense data. How do we then come up with a picture of the world which is compatible with both views of reality, both with the empirical view and with the transcendental view? That's what the Kantian or the Schopenhauerian is aiming for, and why such a person might not be inclined to accept the view of objects as merely material, which is somehow explained by material, or to say that everything is explained by the laws of nature, We can perceive the laws of nature, again, only through the way they affect objects or appear within the behavior of the world of phenomena. The laws of nature are relative to the world of phenomena. And so the kind of world that Schopenhauer is pondering, insofar as he's talking about the world as will, can't be explained with scientific endeavors, ever. Doesn't ever get there. To expand a little further of what we mean by this, that we, experience the laws of nature through objects, we have to talk about the principle of sufficient reason, which I'm not going to get super into in this episode, but we have to talk about it at least a little bit. So in section 4, Schopenhauer discusses how the existence of all matter as we know it must presuppose the concepts of time and space. Just as a precondition for the existence of matter, you have to believe in time and space. Causality, which is where time and space intersect, must also presuppose time and space by that token. And so Schopenhauer writes, quote, "The law of causality receives its meaning and necessity only from the fact that the essence of change does not consist in the mere variation of states or conditions in themselves. On the contrary, it consists in the fact that at the same place in space, there is now one condition or state and then another. And at one and the same point in time, there is here this state and there that state." End quote. And skipping further through the passage, quote, "Change, i.e. variation according to causal law, always concerns a particular part of space and a particular part of time, simultaneously and in union. Consequently, causality unites space and time." End quote. And so he's arguing here from the position of pointing out what he would call a priori knowledge about the world. Just by our means of perceiving the world, of our perception of the world, we gain this a priori knowledge. And this comes, from our perception of duration, impenetrability, divisibility, permanence, mobility, and so on. There are a number of traits or aspects of matter that follow logically from the very idea of distinct objects existing within space and time. This is, to put it simply, what Schopenhauer calls the principle of sufficient reason: knowledge of the subject, of the object, of the relationship between them, which contains within it time, space, and causality. The principle of sufficient reason is how it's the basis of understanding what governs the world of phenomena. It's his means of giving us shorthand for the axioms that we have to accept as a matter of course, just in the practice of applying reason to the world as we experience it, which is the world of appearances. And so we experience objects and phenomena that are subject to causality, which means they exist in space and time and have limitations within those dimensions and so on. And this all follows from the principle of sufficient reason in Schopenhauer's view. He puts this very straightforwardly in section 7, still in book 1, where he writes that time, space, and causality, quote, "belong only to the object, yet because they are essential to the object as such, they can be found also from the subject. In other words, they can be known a priori, and to this extent are to be regarded as the boundary common to both. But they can all be referred to one common expression, the principle of sufficient reason." End quote. And so this is an a priori judgment. Time and space are necessitated by the existence of objects, and thus the existence of objects can lead us to extrapolate to the conclusion that there is time and space, right? Without an understanding of the principle of sufficient reason, without an understanding of causality and permanence and duration and all that, then there is no coherent representation of the world. That's not possible without the principle of sufficient reason. This is part of what makes mankind such a complex manifestation of the will, what Schopenhauer would call a more complete or more visible objectification of the will's nature. We have the principle of sufficient reason, which allows us to make these sophisticated representations of the world, and which allows our will to pursue and strive after ever more individuated and ever more complex aims. Since the world of phenomena is this world of representation, This would imply that the quote-unquote world experienced by lower animals, or by something which merely blindly wills through its drives and by means of stimuli, would not be anything like our own world. This might not even properly be called a world at all, except insofar as it's part of the world as will. A certain degree of intellect or a degree of consciousness is required to represent the world as humans have done. Schopenhauer writes, this is back in section 4, quote, "All causality, hence all matter, and consequently the whole of reality is only for the understanding, through the understanding, in the understanding. The first, simplest, present manifestation of understanding is perception of the actual world. This is, in every way, knowledge of the cause from the effect, and therefore all perception is intellectual," end quote. Further down in the same passage, he writes, quote, "What the eye, the ear, or the hand experiences is not perception. It is mere data. Only by passing of the understanding from the effect to the cause does the world stand out as perception extended in space, varying in respect to form, persisting through all time as regards matter," end quote. So, without our interpretation of the sense data through a conceptual framework, in Schopenhauer's view, there is no reality in the sense that we would normally conceive of reality, which is the world of representation. And this is how Schopenhauer interprets and carries on Kant's transcendental idealism. This is how he understood it. The world we live in is not direct contact with an objective reality, and we don't interface with reality from an absolute perspective. But the world we live in is also not an idealistic creation of subjective experience. That would be a collapse into Berkeleyan idealism, or worse, a collapse into solipsism. Schopenhauer basically sees both views as fundamentally mistaken. The world is not strictly a world of objects, or strictly a world of matter that can be explained solely in material terms. The world is not, also, on the other hand, a purely subjective generation of the consciousness. Those two approaches are sort of what he sees as like the two big errors of epistemology, and he classes the first of those two as materialism, as I've also called it. And his criticism of materialism is as follows: objects can't be separated from representations. He doesn't believe that representations can be their own explanation. Materialism leaves out the subject, in Schopenhauer's view. It tries to take causality, for example, and treat it as an eternal fact. But Schopenhauer constantly reminds us that we only have perception of this fact, or any facts, through the intersection of subject and object, of knower and known. He establishes this framework early on in the text in section 2, where he explains that each person is the knowing subject, whereas their body is an object or representation. And therefore, for Schopenhauer, the subject-object distinction is a priori and universal. Subject and object, in his framing of it, corresponds also to knower and known. For anything to be known, there must be a knower. And without an object to be known, the knower can't exist either, because then there would be nothing to be known, and so you don't really have a knower. And so he writes, quote, "That which knows all things and is known by none is the subject. Everyone finds himself as this subject," end quote. And then further down he writes, quote, "Whatever exists, exists only for the subject," end quote. And so, again, it's only through the intellect that we can make the conceptual framework of causality in order to represent the world to ourselves as the knower. Schopenhauer's problem with materialism is that it assumes a dead world. It assumes that objects can exist without a subject, which he thinks is impossible. He believes that's nonsensical. It's saying the known can exist without the knower. Material objects aren't real for Schopenhauer unless they're represented by the knower. Without the knower to represent reality, we have no way of knowing that there is any reality. And, now, obviously Schopenhauer does believe something still exists independent of knowing. He would say that's the world as will. But that isn't a world with objects or knowable things. This isn't a world we can conceptualize. Or rather, once we do conceptualize about it, it becomes objectified and therefore becomes part of the world of representation, right? So that's the trap of the phenomena-noumena split. Material is something which Schopenhauer considers, therefore, indirectly given to us, because it comes to us through the sense organs. What we do directly know, in Schopenhauer's view, is the immediate knowledge of the representation. The representation is the only thing we have direct knowledge of, but we don't actually know that any material is really out there, for whatever that might mean, in order to have the justification to designate the world as material. Because the status of being a material thing is simply a conceptual designation. So it's a second order, it's a conceptualization or an interpretation. So that's the indirect aspect, right? Of what is directly given to us, which is the representation, the direct empirical experience. And so we're explaining what we directly experience, the representation, in terms of something we would be experiencing only indirectly, which is this conception of the material world. Schopenhauer also seems to find it absurd that we might explain things like will or consciousness through sheer matter. Personally, I think that cuts to the quick of Schopenhauer, his reasons for rejecting materialism. It just doesn't suit his taste. He's part of the German idealistic tradition, which is largely opposed to vulgar materialism and scientism. And he believes a metaphysical stance to be essential as a grounding to any pursuit of knowledge. And he's also, as we said, enamored with the Indian philosophers who hold that the world is lila, or a playing of forces within this world of illusion, and that the true reality behind the veil of Maya is an undifferentiated, indivisible unity. Now, on the other hand, the opposite side of the issue, Schopenhauer also criticizes what you might call vulgar idealism, and he uses Fichte as his whipping boy here. He calls Fichte's philosophy fictitious, and his problem with Fichte is that he leaves out the objective. Fichte thinks that all reality flows forth from the subject, and he thinks Fichte's philosophical mistake is in taking the principle of sufficient reason, which again includes our knowledge of objects and subjects, time and space and causality. Fichte takes this and makes it absolute. And this is not an absolute, Schopenhauer argues. The principle of sufficient reason is relative and conditioned. It exists within the world of phenomena, which we experience. Schopenhauer writes, quote, "With Fichte, by virtue of the principle of sufficient reason as an eterna veritas, the ego is the ground of the world, or of the non-ego, the object, which is just its consequent, its product," end quote. So Fichte's mistake is making the thing in itself into a subject, a knower, as an independent entity which is not dependent on the objective world. And in this sense, he makes the world in itself equivalent with God and with Bishop Berkeley's idealism. But Schopenhauer thinks the subject-object distinction even only obtains in the world of phenomena, in the world of representation. In fact, the thing in itself is not the knower, and it's not the subject. It's the groundless ground of both, which is the will. The will, in Schopenhauer's view, is what creates the very possibility of there being a knower and a known. It's the driving force that brings those things into existence. Schopenhauer is insistent that all of these laws that we perceive, the law of physics, the laws that govern relationships and interactions of material objects, don't reveal anything about this indivisible thing in itself that's the real character of reality. And so he sums up his disagreement with both these schools of metaphysical thought as follows, and we're still reading from section 7. Quote, "The philosophy of Fichte, not otherwise even worth mention, is of interest to us only as the real opposite of the old and original materialism, making a belated appearance. Materialism was the most consistent system starting from the object, as this system was the most consistent starting from the subject. Materialism overlooked the fact that, With the simplest object, it has at once posited the subject as well. So Fichte too overlooked the fact that with the subject, let him give it whatever title he likes, he posited the object, since no subject is thinkable without object. End quote. And so, materialism and idealism, and all their vulgarity and incompleteness, are both what Schopenhauer would classify as the errors and the pitfalls brought on by the development of reason. Schopenhauer argues that logic is a sort of second-order derivation on perception. Direct perception is a purer form of knowledge. And so the development of reason is not a wholly good thing. He writes in section 10, quote, "Reason is feminine in nature. It can give only after it has received," end quote. And then skipping further down the passage, he says, quote, "Concepts in general exist only after previous representations of perception, and in reference to these lies their whole nature," end quote. In other words, conception is secondary to perception, and the double meaning of the term conception in English is apropos of the meaning of calling reason feminine in nature. Reason is a means of coming to judgments by examining abstract concepts, but the concepts themselves are derived from what Schopenhauer calls immediate knowledge, which is the perception of the world, and again, it acts according to the principle of sufficient reason. And so you have to take in the sense data before, as the raw material that reason then needs to do concept formation. And Schopenhauer goes so far as to say that in actual thought, we conduct our thinking in accord with immediate knowledge and leave logic unused. He elaborates on this argument in detail in section 14, asserting that we follow habitual conceptual frameworks in actual practice, and that much of our thinking in terms of perceiving and interpreting the world is spontaneous and automatic. In fact, the ability to employ logic in order to do things like represent complex philosophical problems is not a trait shared by all, and more importantly, it's not a trait needed by most. He's critical of how concept formation can and has led to errors, and how it allows rhetoricians to mislead people. He writes in section 8, quote, "As from the direct light of the sun to the borrowed reflected light of the moon, so do we pass from the immediate representation of perception, which stands by itself and is its own warrant, to reflection, to the abstract discursive concepts of reason, which have their whole content only from that knowledge of perception and in relation to it. As long as our attitude is one of pure perception, all is clear, firm, and certain. There are neither questions, nor doubts, nor errors," end quote. Further down the passage, he writes, quote, "With abstract knowledge, with the faculty of reason, doubt and error have appeared in the theoretical, care and remorse in the practical. If in the representation of perception illusion does at moments distort reality, then in the representation of the abstract, error can reign for thousands of years, impose its iron yoke on whole nations, stifle the noblest impulse of mankind," end quote. And so, unsurprisingly, what we have here is an attitude very similar to Plato when we consider all that has been said thus far. Schopenhauer believes that with a higher degree of intellect, one can gain a more complete understanding of reality, a truer perception of reality, such that, in the Platonic sense, the truly wise person does actually see more than the average person. But many people will be misled by the shadows on the cave wall and the deception of the shadow puppets being paraded around to dupe people with these errors of thought. The wise person goes out into the sunlight of wisdom. But the key thing here, so the intellect, couple takeaways from that, these kinds of considerations here, intellect is not an unmitigated good, but also, even though a lot of people are enslaved by errors, a truly transcendent intellect could effectively perceive a different world from the one that ordinary people do. Really, the last thing we'll talk about today, on this very long episode, will be, this is where another element where we bring in Plato, because the other huge influence of Plato on Schopenhauer's metaphysics is the theory of ideas, also known as the theory of forms. It's a bit confusing because sometimes the title of Schopenhauer's book is translated as World as Will and Idea, rather than the translation I have translates it as World as Will and Representation. But I don't like the translation saying world as will and idea, because representations and ideas in Schopenhauer's philosophy are actually two distinct terms. He directly references Plato's theory of ideas in the book, and the Platonic idea, it's a totally separate thing from just the general term representation. A representation is any perception of any object or phenomena in the world that's known by the knowing subject. The way Schopenhauer uses the Platonic forms, or the Platonic ideas, is not to refer to the representations themselves. What he was referring to is the gradations of the representations. And what this means will require further explanation. As I mentioned before, Schopenhauer argues there isn't more of the will in a man than there is in a stone. The will is one at all times and always, everywhere, equally distributed. The way he thinks about it instead is the degree to which the will is revealed, which is to say objectified or manifested, which is to say perceived and represented. And so this is what he means. He says in this respect, there is more visible will in a plant than in a stone. There's more visible will in the animal than in the plant, and then there's more in the human than in the animal. The will reveals itself, becomes more and more visible, more realized, in these higher and higher forms. And so these gradations, then, of different classes of things, men, animals, stones, to put it in descending order, or even then with the laws of physics, gravity, causality, and so on. These are all to be understood synonymously with Plato's theory of ideas. All of these are objectifications of the will, but they exist at a different gradient, at a different gradation. Schopenhauer argues that Kant misused the word idea, and he clarifies that he uses the term in the Platonic sense. He quotes Diogenes Laertius, who gives the shortest and most concise description of the Platonic doctrine, quote, Plato teaches that the ideas exist in nature, so to speak, as patterns or prototypes, and that the remainder of things only resemble them and exist as their copies, end quote. And then to clarify how Platonic ideas fit into his own philosophical system, Schopenhauer writes, quote, by idea I understand every definite and fixed grade of the will's objectification, end quote. So, what has taken shape so far? This is an atheistic world. It's a world without any meaning other than the will blindly striving to exist in every conceivable pattern or another. And the will is represented in one form or another by these conscious beings that have been called out of its bosom to experience it as beings with an intellect, and that's the human condition. This is at bottom a senseless world. It's not created by an intelligence or redeemed by a god. The world at its base is something totally unintelligent, the will. And this will is not sentient or conscious in the sense of a god or a personal being, but the will is, you could say, it's consciousness itself, sort of in the sense of the Atman and the doctrine of Advaita Vedanta. Will exists as the consciousness of all beings, so that we can't say that it's without consciousness because we're conscious and we are the will. And so Schopenhauer quotes a mystic, Angelus Silesius, who wrote, quote, I know God cannot live a moment without me. If I should come to naught, he too must cease to be, end quote. And so in Schopenhauer's argument, that's like a mystical epiphany of the coterminous nature of the will with all being, which one experiences directly in their own consciousness. Only with Silesius, it's represented in religious language. And, it's interpreted as the consciousness of the Godhead being synonymous with the consciousness of Silesius himself, with the knowing subject. But so this omnipresent will has consciousness only in its manifest forms, in the objectified or the represented form. In its essence, the will is blind. And although perhaps it has that immediate intelligence that Schopenhauer ascribes even to the animals, and seemingly even to forces or physical laws, inanimate objects, the immediate knowledge pushes the phenomenon in a certain direction. And this is felt and not thought. It's non-rational, or we might even say pre-rational. And that's the essence of everything. And so in this schema, Schopenhauer then brings in the Platonic forms as a means of explaining or classifying all the different phenomena within that world as will and representation. And the gradations are according to how fully the will is revealed or made visible in all of these different things. The term he uses is principium individuationis, the principle of individuation. Representations come into existence by becoming distinct from other phenomena. And so Schopenhauer says, the lowest gradation of the will, the most general ideas here in the Platonic sense, are the laws of nature themselves. So gravity. And so he writes in section 27. This is in book 2. Quote, "We should see the will express itself here in the lowest grade as blind striving, an obscure, inarticulate impulse, far from susceptible of being directly known. It is the simplest and the weakest mode of its objectification. But it appears as this blind and unconscious striving in the whole of unorganized nature, and all those original forces of which it is the work of physics and chemistry to discover and to study the laws, and each of which manifests itself to us in millions of phenomena which are exactly similar and regular, and show no trace of individual character, but are mere multiplicity through space and time, i.e., through the principium individuationis, as a picture is multiplied through the facets of a glass." End quote. So the laws that obtain over everything in reality, like gravity. How does gravity exist? Well, it exists as a property of objects with mass, right? So the lowest gradations of the will, in Schopenhauer's view, exist as properties or facets of all phenomena. They're so generalized that they lack all individual expression. And so gravity exists equally in all objects with mass, or rather distributed equally through all mass itself, I guess we could say. You might have more mass in a certain area, but mass itself all has gravity. And so the story of the world for Schopenhauer is the story of the will striving for higher and higher gradations, higher objectifications of itself, which means more individuated, more visible, more perceptible objectifications. So at the lowest gradation, we have forces. At higher gradations, we get inanimate objects. Then plants, lower organisms. Each of them has more potential to manifest uniqueness and individuality, to be a distinct thing, which is the very nature of the world of representation. Everything makes its own distinct, specific demand on reality in whatever form it takes, and it's driven by its own purposes, its own goals, its own aims, which then clash with all these other representations of the will. And therefore, through this striving, and inevitably through conflict, the will is more fully revealed. The more particular and contrived desires dictate the higher gradations or patterns in which the manifested will takes shape. And so eventually then we get to mankind, where these types or patterns become so specific that Schopenhauer argues each man could very well be his own Platonic idea. And so he writes in section 28, quote, "The character of each individual man, so far as it is thoroughly individual and not entirely included in that of the species, may be regarded as a special idea, corresponding to a special act of the objectification of will." End quote. So whereas in lower species of animals, the species differ from one another, but one ant doesn't differ too greatly from another ant of the same species, in man the differences can be so extreme. People can be aimed at ends or goals which are mutually exclusive and incompatible with one another. People live in such extremely different environments and have such wildly differing cultural norms and societal standards and moral agendas. And so Schopenhauer considers man to be the most sophisticated and most visible objectification of the will that exists. And he effectively starts from man as the justification of reality and the origin of reality. Not the origin of the noumenal world, the world of the will, but in terms of the world of representation that Schopenhauer believes mankind, the subject, to be a sort of precondition of, right? And so he writes in section 28, quote, "In order to manifest the full significance of the will, the idea of man would need to appear, not alone and sundered from everything else, but accompanied by the whole species of grades, down through all the forms of animals, through the vegetable kingdom to unorganized nature. All these supplement each other in the complete objectification of will. They are as much presupposed by the idea of man as the blossoms of a tree presuppose leaves, branches, stem, and root. They form a pyramid, of which man is the apex. If fond of similes, one might also say that their manifestations accompany that of man as necessarily as the full daylight is accompanied by all the gradations of twilight, through which, little by little, it loses itself in darkness. Or one might call them the echo of man, and say animal and plant are the descending fifth and third of man, the inorganic kingdom is the lower octave." End quote. And so you'll find many more music metaphors for describing these metaphysical positions if you decide to read Schopenhauer for yourself. What is implied by this passage is these gradations depend on one another. Mankind does not and cannot sensibly exist outside of an ecosystem that mankind depends on. Mankind exists in dependence on that ecosystem, and thus also in dependence on weather patterns and climate and geological processes and all the laws governing that, and so on and so forth, until we conclude that man depends on the most rudimentary objectifications of the will, the physical laws, just as well as he needs other animals and plants in order to find sustenance. And so further down in the passage, Schopenhauer writes, quote, "We find, however, that the inner necessity of the gradation of its manifestations, which is inseparable from the adequate objectification of the will, is expressed by an outer necessity in the whole of these manifestations themselves, by reason of which man has need of the beasts for his support. The beasts and their grades have need of each other, as well as of plants, which in turn require the ground, water, chemical elements and their combinations, the planet, the sun, rotation and motion around the sun, the curve of the ellipse, etc., etc. At bottom, this results from the fact that the will must live on itself, for there exists nothing beside it, and it is a hungry will. Hence arise eager pursuit, anxiety, and suffering." End quote. In short, everything survives by consuming and dominating the lower gradations of existence. The will exists in a constant state of strife with itself, ever moving in directions which never ultimately satisfy it. Every pursuit brings at best a momentary relief, for the will is ever hungry, and what satisfies one manifestation of the will means the destruction of another. Think of the good of the owl versus the good of the mouse. The various gradations of the will can therefore never know peace in the world of representation. As they strive to exist, that striving brings them into conflict with others, and the contest never ends because the will is never satisfied. And from this assessment, you may be starting to get a picture of the depressing world that Schopenhauer established in his writing, and just why it is he's considered the great pessimist. But we won't get fully into that until the next episode. But we'll look at one more passage, and this passage is in section 29, and it's at the end of Book 2. And it elaborates on this vision of the world and will perhaps titillate you further as to the depressing nature of Schopenhauer's outlook. He writes, quote, "In fact, freedom from all aim, from all limits, belongs to the nature of the will, which is an endless striving. This was already touched on above in the reference to centrifugal force. It also discloses itself in its simplest form and the lowest grade of the objectification of will, in gravitation, which we see constantly exerting itself, though a final goal is obviously impossible for it. For if, according to its will, all existing matter were collected in one mass, yet within this mass gravity, ever striving towards the center, would still wage war with impenetrability as rigidity or elasticity. The tendency of matter can therefore only be confined, never completed or appeased. But this is precisely the case with all tendencies, of all phenomena of will. Every attained end is also the beginning of a new course, and so on ad infinitum. The plant raises its manifestation from the seed through the stem and the leaf to the blossom and the fruit, which again is the beginning of a new seed, a new individual that runs through the old course, and so on through endless time. Such also is the life of the animal. Procreation is its highest point, and after attaining to it, the life of the first individual quickly or slowly sinks, while a new life ensures to nature the endurance of the species and repeats the same phenomena. Indeed, the constant renewal of the matter of every organism is also to be regarded as merely the manifestation of this continual pressure and change, and physiologists are now ceasing to hold that it is the necessary reparation of the matter wasted in motion, for the possible wearing out of the machine can by no means be equivalent to the support it is constantly receiving through nourishment. Eternal becoming, endless flux, characterizes the revelation of the inner nature of will. Finally, the same thing shows itself in human endeavors and desires, which always delude us by presenting their satisfaction as the final end of will. As soon as we attain to them, they no longer appear the same, and therefore they soon grow stale, are forgotten, and though not openly disowned, are yet always thrown aside as vanished illusions. We are fortunate enough, if there still remains something to wish for and to strive after, that the game may be kept up of constant transition from desire to satisfaction, and from satisfaction to a new desire, the rapid course of which is called happiness, and the slow course sorrow, and does not sink into that stagnation that shows itself in fearful ennui that paralyzes life, vain yearning without a definite object, deadening languor. According to all this, when the will is enlightened by knowledge, it always knows what it wills now and here, never what it wills in general. Every particular act of will has its end, the whole will has none, just as every particular phenomenon of nature is determined by a sufficient cause so far as concerns its appearance in this place at this time, but the force which manifests itself in it has no general cause, for it belongs to the thing in itself, to the groundless will." End quote. And so, we gain an insight into the inner truth of nature by looking to our own will. What is the nature of that will? It's never satisfied. Willing is the underlying process of reality. That's the vision here. When one attains one of the will's specific goals, one of their own goals, this does nothing to change the will's general goal or its general character. Its general character is to strive and seek and pursue and desire. Not to be satisfied, not to have its desires sated, but to continue desiring. And so once those desires are fulfilled, suddenly the will's no longer satiated by what it just before seemed like it couldn't bear not to have. And this is Schopenhauer's explanation of both the inner character of our own lives and of reality itself. As abstract and overly conceptual as this episode has probably been for many of you, if you've stuck it out to the very end, hopefully you can now see the connection between Schopenhauer's attitude towards life and his metaphysics. The fundamental Western orientation towards philosophy was through this idea of the two worlds, the world of mere appearance and the world as such. Plato and Kant had affirmed this division, and Schopenhauer embraced them both fully and sought to synthesize them. And this idea that had seized him at a young age, such that he wrote World as Will and Representation at 28, didn't change at all for the rest of his life. And I think this comes from Schopenhauer's temperament. And what he found, I think, to match his temperament philosophically, he found from the ancients in the form of Vedic philosophy. And this idea around which the rest of his philosophy is a mere elaboration is that conviction that he expresses at the end, that all life, all existence is at bottom of one character, and that it has a single intelligible character which exists beyond any of its individual representations, and that finally, because it is one, we can gain an awareness of what this one is, because we're part and parcel with it. And by investigating ourselves in our own awareness, we can come to understand it as the will. This will is, as he elaborates later, the will to exist, the will to be. Every individual objectification of the will strives against one another, making the world of representation a battleground. But for all this horror and strife, the true world, which is itself blind will, is never divided, never dies nor is born, never passes away or changes. And so we have the agreement with those, among the Indian philosophers and Schopenhauer, the simultaneous assertion that the world is already pure and liberated and free in every respect, and yet the world as we experience it is one of injustice and violence and tragedy. Because our nature is to strive and to cling to existence against all these laws of nature that eventually overcome us and subsume us. We live in suffering, in a state of either want or dissatisfaction. Now, if only a person could use this power of reflection that we've gained, the ability for representing the world, which still comes to us through the will, right? It's bestowed onto us by the will striving such for individuality that it creates these beings that can represent the world into concepts. But what if there's some way man could take advantage of his existence at this point as the highest gradient of the will's manifestations in order to free himself from the suffering of the world? A person that could attain that kind of liberation would be able to use their reason to perceive the world in a different way. And perhaps by seeing the illusory, dreamlike nature of phenomena, one could rationally come to understand that desiring such phenomena is ultimately unsatisfying. And perhaps by that realization, you could train the mind to stop striving. But since striving is the very character of the will, and the will is the world, that means a rejection of the world. And that's where Schopenhauer's philosophy all leads. But we'll talk about that next week, because we're already way over on time from what I imagined we'd be. But you get a long episode this week. All right, hopefully it'll be even darker and colder by then, at least for us folks in the Northern Hemisphere. Join me next Tuesday, where we discuss Part 2, Schopenhauer, the Great Pessimist. Signing off. If you imagine, insofar as it is approximately possible, the sum total of distress, pain, and suffering of every kind which the sun shines upon in its course, you will have to admit it would have been much better if the sun had been able to call up the phenomenon of life as little on the earth as on the moon, and if, here as there, the surface were still in a crystalline condition. You can look upon our life as an episode unprofitably disturbing the blessed calm of nothingness. In any case, even he who has found life tolerably bearable will, the longer he lives, feel the more clearly that on the whole it is a disappointment, nay, a cheat. If two men who were friends in youth meet in old age, after a lapse of an entire generation, the principal feeling the sight of one another, linked as it is with the recollections of earlier years, will arouse in both, will be one of total disappointment with the whole of life, which once lay so fair before them in the rosy dawn of youth, promised so much, and performed so little. End quote. That's from the essay On the Suffering of the World from section 9. I wanted to start with the unrestrained, unadulterated, absolutely life-denying side of Schopenhauer this week. Some would say it's his only side. But if you've been following along since the last episode, hopefully I made at least some impression about how Schopenhauer is, he's willing to restrain his attitude of absolute sorrow and lamentation, at least within the context of his rigorous philosophical arguments, in order to lay out his picture of the world and his picture of human life within that world. To give his epistemological framework for philosophizing and his ontological claims about, what the world really is, we went through, I would say, a very methodical in tone first couple of books last week. The world is both our representation of it, because that is how we come to know anything about the world of objects and phenomena and the laws governing that world. And the world is will, because the will is our insight into the thing in itself, into the inner character of all those objects and laws. But Schopenhauer's ethical conclusions from this picture of the world turn towards an attitude of complete cynicism and the idea that life itself is not worth living. Insofar as there are any ethical imperatives for us while in this life, it is to achieve a negation or denial of the will. And the reason as given is that this world is fundamentally an aimless thing, which is ruled by suffering. As we discussed at the end of the last episode, as far as Schopenhauer sees it, the will is never satisfied. It may satisfy an individual aim, but its nature is willing, not satisfaction. And so as soon as the individual aims are fulfilled, the willing goes on in the form of new desires, new willing phenomena, new objectifications, new pursuits, new hunger. I remember he says it is a hungry will, ever hungry. It's a hunger that can never be satiated. And thus, the inherent character of our existence is one of endless frustration and dissatisfaction. So in this episode, part 2, it may even be darker than the last one. But also, this episode is going to contain Schopenhauer's gospel, which, gospel, of course, means good news, which is a bit funny to say in the context of how dark Schopenhauer's philosophy is. But his good news is the denial of the will that we mentioned, which is only possible for human beings. Why is that? Well, skipping back into section 7 of the same essay on the suffering of the world, Schopenhauer writes how knowledge creates greater suffering than before. Just to recap briefly, we were talking last time about how everything in the world is will. That includes inorganic objects, plants, animals, human beings, and so on. And so only human beings can negate the will, but the will is just as manifest in, the behavior of animals as well. But human beings possess greater knowledge. And so he writes how knowledge creates greater suffering. He does say that knowledge in and of itself is painless, but what knowledge brings us is the ability to illumine the character of the will. And so Schopenhauer writes, quote, "Will is the string, its frustration or impediment, the vibration of the string, knowledge the sounding board, and pain the sound," end quote. So pain increases with the awareness created by knowledge. He says that knowledge also increases our capacity for pleasure, but only by a little, compared with how much more suffering we now are able to be aware of, you might say, to comprehend. And after all, this heightened capacity for suffering, for the kinds of suffering that only a being like us, a human being, the brain, with complex desires and goals and a self-image, the kind of suffering that only we can have. This is a type of sublime, more complex suffering. That is what gives us this push to seek for an end to this world of willing. The highest gradation of the will, mankind, has the most pronounced suffering, but man's knowledge also exists at precisely the gradation at which there exists the possibility of the denial of the will. And so he writes, and this is in that same section of the essay, section 7, quote, "At each higher stage of animal life, there is a corresponding increase in pain. In the lowest animals, it is extremely slight, but even in the highest, it nowhere approaches the pain which man is capable of feeling, since even the highest animals lack thought and concepts. And it is right that this capacity for pain should reach its zenith only where, by virtue of the existence of reason, there also exists the possibility of denial of the will, for otherwise it would be nothing but aimless cruelty." End quote. And so there's this promise of the ability to deny the will here. He quotes a saying from Ecclesiastes. This is in World as Will and Representation, actually, but he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. And that's from Ecclesiastes. So he says that even in the plant we can recognize a ceaseless, restless striving. We can see that, he thinks that's sort of represented, so to speak, in how the growth of even things like plants. But because plants have no sentience, they have no pain, at least in the way that we would think of pain. The sentience gained by higher objectifications of the will enhances pain. And one way it does this is by increasing finitude, we might say. So even though we exist in limitless time and space, under Schopenhauer's ontology, the human being finds himself to be finite, projected into this individual lifetime, and every life is always sliding towards death at every moment. All individuated existence is considered from the ultimate perspective a constant continuous dying, he writes, a constant push of all things into death. And the human being is the most aware of this out of any of the individuated phenomena. And we're among the most individuated, right? Because each man constitutes his own special Platonic form in Schopenhauer's view. And so we need the intellect to have true pain that a human being is capable. The result of this, however, is that man becomes able to conceive of the denial of the will, and he actually sees that it's reasonable to deny the will. And so Schopenhauer writes, this is in Book 4, Section 56, quote, "For this reason, we wish to consider in human existence the inner and essential destiny of the will. Everyone will readily find the same thing once more in the life of the animal, only more feebly expressed in various degrees. He can also sufficiently convince himself in the suffering animal world how essentially all life is suffering." End quote. So our greater knowledge, the will is just blindly striving on normally. But with the gradation of human beings of the will, we gain this insight into suffering. And the more clear and precise our resolution into the nature of the world, the more we become aware of this inevitable fact. And so we ask, how can we end that suffering? Human beings are the first being that's capable of asking that question. And Schopenhauer's answer to it is the negation of the will, and the idea that this might be a kind of salvation for mankind. What's interesting to me here is that Schopenhauer has effectively provided an atheistic argument that still makes the existence of a person's life meaningful in a teleological sense, as in your life is or can be lived for a purpose. It isn't just over when you die, so who cares? Because, as he writes, the will continue to go on in its blind striving, causing all this pain, unless human beings take it upon themselves as a moral duty to stop striving, stop willing to exist. And the kind of salvation offered cannot be mentioned without raising a comparison to Buddhism here. There's the idea of the arahant, as they say in the Theravada tradition, which is another word for what we might call a saint. it's not really a good translation, but it's the closest thing we can probably get in English. Or, in the Mahayana tradition, they would talk about an enlightened Buddha. That's by the time of the Mahayana, there's a lot of Buddhas. Schopenhauer was, of course, he was influenced by this religious ideal coming from the East of an individual through correct action and through a whole course of mental and moral training. The idea that an individual could stop their craving, stop desiring, stop willing. And that by that token, you gain an exit to the world of incarnation and suffering. And in Buddhism, for example, the stakes are very clear. Human life is incredibly valuable because being born as a human on the great wheel of becoming is said to be very rare. You could be born as an animal or a ghost or as one of the sufferers in hell or as a deva or an asura. But only humans have the ability to train and reach enlightenment. And so Schopenhauer's idea of the person using reason to stop desiring and thus to deny the will to exist is a perfect parallel to the Buddhist idea of enlightenment, becoming free of tanha, which is thirsting or craving. By letting go of all desires, the Buddhist is, the Buddhist doctrine is you'll be able to stop incarnating into all these cycles of becoming, which in Buddhism is called samsara. And then you have the enlightenment aspect as well in Buddhism, the idea of achieving nirvana, which you could translate as the extinguishment of all desire, all clinging. And the argument in Buddhism is that clinging, that desiring, it's the clinging to becoming that keeps you being reborn into becoming within this dependent existence. And so the parallels are very clear, the influence is very clear on Schopenhauer ethically, that he is putting Buddhism into a Western philosophical system. Schopenhauer outlines in Book 3 the means of achieving, or a means of achieving liberation from the blind striving nature of the will. But he uses means which are not ascetic, but aesthetic. For Schopenhauer, the direct exit from the will exists in art, creation of art, contemplation of art. Schopenhauer has a very unique interpretation of what art is and what the aesthetic experience is and what the value of aesthetics are. It's actually one I very much disagree with. But it's a view that influenced Nietzsche, though, very greatly. And Nietzsche criticized this view too, but he, when we get on to talking about Nietzsche's aesthetics, in many ways you could see it as a modification or a transformation, a critical update on Schopenhauer's work, you might say. But Schopenhauer's views on art unifies several threads of Schopenhauer's thought that we laid out in the last episode. And they all kind of weave together when he's considering art and aesthetics in Book 3. So there's the problem of the will's eternal striving and the suffering this causes. There is the need of finding some means of denying the will in order to gain liberation from that suffering. There's the discussion of the Platonic forms or the Platonic ideals that we brought into it and how they fit into this whole philosophy. And finally, the question of what practical form this philosophy will take that incorporates all these elements. And all of these threads are woven together in Schopenhauer's view on art. Schopenhauer writes in section 49, quote, "The object of art, the depiction of which is the aim of the artist, and the knowledge of which must consequently precede his work as its germ and source, is an idea in Plato's sense, and absolutely nothing else, not the particular thing, the object of common comprehension, and not the concept, the object of rational thought and of science," end quote. And that's from actually near the end of Book 3, but it sums up the overall view he gives of art, that the Platonic idea is what is being depicted and contemplated in art, and that the contemplation of the Platonic idea is, in itself, the liberation from the suffering caused by the will. Now I guess I'll have to outlay the argument as to how he gets there, because it requires some explanation. So he begins Book 3 with a recapitulation to the idea that he has, discovered this agreement between Plato and Kant, and how even though people have pointed out the differences between the philosophies of Plato and Kant, or framed their philosophical ideas in different ways, and they both talked about them in very different language, ultimately Schopenhauer believes that both men pointed to the same fundamental truth, which is discoverable by reason, and that Plato's ideas identify something which is not strictly phenomena nor thing in itself. That is to say, the will's gradations, the different patterns and levels at which the will objectifies itself, which Schopenhauer calls the forms. He says they are not the thing in itself, but they're a unique category of representation which are not subject to the laws of, impermanence and plurality, like all other phenomena would be. So to explain what this means, we'll defer to Schopenhauer, Book 3, Section 32, quote, "The Platonic idea is necessarily object, something known, a representation, and precisely, but only in this respect, is it different from the thing in itself. It has laid aside merely the subordinate forms of the phenomenon, and all of which we include under the principle of sufficient reason, or rather, it has not yet entered into them. But it has retained the first and most universal form, namely that of the representation in general, that of being object for a subject. It is the form subordinate to this, the general expression of which is the principle of sufficient reason, which multiply the idea in particular in fleeting individuals, whose number in respect to the idea is a matter of complete indifference." End quote. And then skipping down a little bit in the passage before continuing, quote, "Between it and the thing in itself, the idea still stands as the only direct objectivity of the will, since it has not assumed any other form peculiar to knowledge as such, except that of the representation in general, i.e., that of being object for a subject. Therefore, it alone is the most adequate objectivity possible of the will, or of the thing in itself. Indeed, it is even the whole thing in itself, only under the form of representation. Here lies the ground of the agreement between Plato and Kant, although in strict accuracy, that of which they both speak is not the same." End quote. So, as Schopenhauer said in the past episode, or as we talked about Schopenhauer saying in the past episode, the gradations of the will's objectification, which he considers to be the same as Platonic forms, are natural laws and forces, inorganic matter, plants, animals, finally mankind. Each individual person stands for his own special, individualized Platonic idea. And so each phenomenon is a particular pattern within the material world that the will can take. The Platonic form you might consider a blueprint for all of the individual phenomena that exist. So to put this into words that a secularist or a materialist can understand, because there's the obvious objection, right, that the idea of a Platonic form, the reason why many of us modern people reject that idea is because it's not obvious how that works in practical reality, right? Why it also suggests a sort of teleology for organisms and natural phenomena that it may seem unjustified to claim. But let's put it into different language. In the case of biological evolution, we have examples in the fossil record, and insofar from what we know of mapping, the genome of the animal kingdom, that certain types of animals independently evolve into the same forms. You might remember there were some pop science articles recently about how a lot of species just end up evolving into crabs. There's actually a name for this. It's called carcinization. It's an evolutionary pattern followed over and over again by crustaceans. A species mutates from a non-crab-like form into a crab-like form, obviously over many, many generations. But it happens over and over again. This is a phenomenon known as convergent evolution. There are other examples of it, but let's think about what the phenomenon of convergent evolution implies. We know that certain material forms and certain genetic combinations from this example, what you might call a certain biological pattern, is selected for by the process of natural selection. What's ultimately selected for is survivability from a Darwinian perspective, or if you believe in, Nietzschean evolution, what's selected for is power. From my perspective, you could regard those two terms as largely referring to the same thing. But in any case, certain patterns are more survivable than others. And we know from convergent evolution that it isn't totally random and senseless, and that what patterns survive it's not totally based on chance. We know that the environment will sometimes produce the same patterns, meaning that multiple organisms with different genomes move towards that same pattern. Another way of saying this is that certain patterns are implied by the physical conditions, which means certain patterns are implied by reality. Reality itself, in a blind, unconscious process, produces situations into which certain patterns emerge to fulfill those situations. So the pressures on crustaceans tend to push them toward the pattern, or what we might call the Platonic idea of the crab. Carcinization is crustaceans realizing the Platonic form of the crab, that is the ideal crustacean. And so to Schopenhauer, the Platonic form is even more real than the individual example of the species, again using the Platonic idea, here referring to Platonic ideas of different animals. And this is because the individuals come and go, but this has no bearing on the pattern. As we see in the example of carcinization, even the whole species sometimes goes, but the pattern still calls the objects of the world into that same form. The pattern exists independently of whether the individuals survive or not. We could extrapolate this to mean that every single phenomenon which comes into being does so in response to the conditions set by materiality, producing this possibility for it to exist. To speak metaphysically, that's reality willing something to exist. And the most real form of phenomenal existence is as the possibility itself rather than the individual phenomena, as we've said, the pattern. To use an example from astronomy, individual stars exist, but stars are born and eventually stars die. So now our modern materialist thinking says that the world is a world of objects and that the stars, the actual individual stars, those are the real phenomena, right? Schopenhauer's opposite perspective to this might be akin to saying, no, the real phenomenon is the process of star formation itself, the conditions that produce stars, no matter what. Once those conditions come into alignment, you will get stars. That is what is real. And that is what we can represent with the math behind star formation, what you might call the discovery of a pattern in nature itself. And the Schopenhauerian argument might be to liken the math behind star formation to a Platonic idea of a star. It's not the math itself, of course. The math is just another series of symbols of representation within a language we've all invented together as humans. But it's the actual physical processes to which the math refers, the conditions of reality that don't just produce, that's too weak of a word, the conditions that necessitate that there are stars. The pattern emerges to fill that void, to fill the need or the will of reality. And so this is the relationship between the Platonic ideas and what we class as like an ordinary representation. The other representations are subject to the principle of sufficient reason, as Schopenhauer calls it. Subject and object, causality, time, space, and so on. The Platonic ideas are not subject to this in the same way. They only exist within that world of subject and object because they're still, as he says in that quote we read, there's still things that it's our way of representing the thing in itself to ourselves. So it's still a representation. But in the Platonic ideas, we can behold objectification itself, the object itself. And it's in contemplating the idea of something, the pattern of something, that we can regard a phenomena or a representation that does not stir the will within us. The patterns themselves are the most directly known objects, but they're not objects of the will. Speaking here of our individualized, peculiar goals and desires. A man doesn't desire the pattern of a woman, the Platonic idea of a woman, necessitated by the evolutionary and biological reality of, having a species with a male and female sex manifest in human beings, which exists beyond any individual woman. No, a straight man desires the individual woman, not the pattern. And it's not the pattern itself that can injure you or that you can suffer from a want of. Since we suffer from external stimuli, the external suffering can only come to us from objects that exist within the principle of sufficient reason. Individuated things and beings that we come into contact with in this world of, struggles between the will. The Platonic idea, the pattern itself, does not partake in reality in that same way. And so this is Schopenhauer's entry point for the liberation from our enslavement to our desires. And that liberation comes from within artistic contemplation. He describes the basis of this process in section 34, where he says that, quote, knowledge tears itself free from the service of the will precisely by the subject ceasing to be merely individual and being now a pure, will-less subject of knowledge, end quote. So this is the role of knowledge in negating the will. Knowledge evolved in service of the will. We gained our knowledge in order to perpetuate the will to exist and its cravings. But by using this knowledge, we can undermine the very thing that brought it into being. And he elaborates a little further down in that same passage, quote, raised up by the power of the mind, we relinquish the ordinary way of considering things and cease to follow under the guidance of the forms of the principle of sufficient reason merely their relations to one another, whose final goal is always the relation to our own will. Thus we no longer consider the where, the when, the why, and the whither in things, but simply and solely the what. Further, we do not let abstract thought, the concepts of reason, take possession of our consciousness, but instead of all this, devote the whole power of the mind to perception, sink ourselves completely therein, and let our whole consciousness be filled by the calm contemplation of the natural object actually present, whether it be a landscape, a tree, a rock, a crag, a building, or anything else. We lose ourselves entirely in this object, to use a pregnant expression. In other words, we forget our individuality, our will, and continue to exist only as pure subject, a clear mirror of the object, so that it is as though the object alone existed without anyone to perceive it, and thus we are no longer able to separate the perceiver from the perception, but the two have become one, since the entire consciousness is filled and occupied by a single image of perception. End quote. I have a lot to say about this passage. For one, this idea of disinterested contemplation works with both the Eastern idea of meditation and at least some dimension of what we mean by the appreciation of art in the West. But I think that Schopenhauer is therefore narrowing a definition of art in a sense to exclude some things that other people might consider as art, such that at the very least we could just say his idea of a truly aesthetic experience or of truly aesthetic creativity would involve only the art which is done from that place of selfless perception and contemplation of the object. And speaking as an artist myself, that is not my experience with art. But I do think the view of art he's outlining here is contained within Nietzsche's later idea of the Apollinean. And I think that's why he had to invent the Dionysian as a counterbalance, because Nietzsche believed that this view of art did not contain the whole of the artistic experience. There's something orgiastic and indulgent about the musical or revelrous sides of art, for example. But Schopenhauer's conception of art applies, I think, mostly to the visual arts, to drama, to poetry, sculpture, painting, architecture, things of that nature. plastic arts, language arts, visual arts. But let's set that aside for a moment and suppose that, whatever we want to say about art and the aesthetic experience overall, because I know that'll be a contentious topic, Schopenhauer is pointing to some real phenomenon that can be achieved by art, just as it could be achieved by Eastern meditation. And to be honest, you could interpret the passage above, or the one I just read, in the most general terms to be a form of meditation that he's describing. Most meditative activities involve fixing the mind on a single discernible object on which the awareness is totally focused. And so even though thoughts usually arise, the meditator has to simply let them pass and not attach to them, and instead continually return his focus to the object of meditation, which is what Schopenhauer advises. He says we're not going to entertain conceptual thoughts. And a common experience that meditators report when doing a mantra meditation, where they repeat the same mantra over and over again, is that eventually the words lose all meaning. And one can have a sense of losing oneself, as Schopenhauer puts it here, losing the subject-object distinction. He uses the metaphor of being a clear mirror that simply reflects the perception of the object. Funnily enough, this is like the same metaphor used in the famous Zen Buddhist story of the poetry contest between Shunhui and Huineng. Huineng's famous poem in that story, he uses the metaphor of the mind as a mirror. Quote, "The mind is the Bodhi tree. The body is the bright mirror's stand. The bright mirror is originally clean and pure. Where could there be any dust?" End quote. And so, in that poem, the body, the thing that perceives the sense information, right, all comes through the sense organs of the body. It's just the body is the bright mirror's stand, but the mirror is originally clean and pure. And dust, in the Buddhist tradition, when they talk about dust, that's like your attachment or clinging that comes in through the senses. Schopenhauer goes on in the passage we were just talking about to quote from Byron, who wrote, quote, "Are not the mountains, waves, and skies a part of me and of my soul, as I of them?" End quote. Which is also interesting because you hear that same kind of language in a lot of Zen Buddhist stories. But Schopenhauer writes of these lines by Byron that, quote, "Whoever has in the manner stated become so absorbed and lost in the perception of nature that he exists only as a purely knowing subject, becomes in this way immediately aware that, as such, he is the condition and hence the supporter of the world and of all objective existence, for this now shows itself as dependent on his existence. He therefore draws nature into himself, so that he feels it to be only an accident of his own being." End quote. So, through the absorption into pure perception, one can lose themselves as the subject and momentarily become will-less. He likens this state of mind to the one most highly prized by Epicurus. He believes this is a state possible for the enlightened philosopher, here using the term enlightened quite differently from the Buddhist sense, although I'm sure that both concepts probably swam around in Schopenhauer's mind. This is in section 38, quote, "It is the state where simultaneously and inseparably the perceived individual thing is raised to the idea of its species, and the knowing individual to the pure subject of will-less knowing, and now the two, as such, no longer stand in the stream of time and of all other relations." End quote. So Schopenhauer believed that this state is possible through art, or perhaps through, we might extend that to aesthetic practice and Eastern meditation. And as a result, when you begin to look at the world in that means of perception, the world becomes this fleeting, dreamlike existence. And just to bring it back to why somebody might want to achieve this state that he's describing, we're the only thing, or we're the world only representation, as he says in the second book, were it only representation and nothing besides, it would simply pass us by and we wouldn't even notice it, But it's our will that fills the world and all the objects of the world with meaning and causes all of our striving and suffering. It's not the Platonic idea of an object that makes you suffer, as we said. And so you focus on that, the pure representation, rather than on the individual targets and desires of your will, which will only continue you suffering because, your pursuit of the will's desires only ever leads to suffering. So Schopenhauer continues in section 38, quote, "All willing springs from lack, from deficiency, and thus from suffering. Fulfillment brings this to an end, yet for one wish that is fulfilled there remain at least 10 that are denied. Further, desiring lasts a long time. Demands and requests go on to infinity. Fulfillment is short and meted out sparingly. But even the final satisfaction itself is only apparent. The wish fulfilled at once makes its way for a new one. The former is a known delusion, the latter a delusion not as yet known. No attained object of willing can give a satisfaction that lasts and no longer declines, but it is always like the alms thrown to a beggar, which reprieves him today so that his misery may be prolonged till tomorrow." End quote. So that was just to recap again, that desires do lead to suffering invariably and without fail. The will always leads to suffering. So the result of following any course of action is ultimately disappointment. Further down in the passage, he compares mankind to one lying on the revolving wheel of Ixion, or to the eternally thirsting Tantalus, both examples from Greek mythology. And this is apropos of the Buddhist outlook, wherein as the dwellers in samsara, our lives are at least somewhat hellish, and we've all been incarnated into hell in the past in Buddhist cosmology, and likely will again in the future. Schopenhauer really does mean that our striving in this world is akin to being like Sisyphus in the here and now, pushing a heavy boulder uphill to no point and no purpose, completely in vain, and prolonging his own suffering the harder he strives. And so after learning all this about Schopenhauer, it may surprise you to know his favorite style of art were the Dutch realist painters. Schopenhauer writes they were the type of artists who brought forth this opportunity for negating the will and becoming the pure will-less subject, that they perfected this. This is also from section 38, quote, "Inward disposition, predominance of knowing over willing, can bring about this state in any environment. This is shown by those admirable Dutchmen who directed such purely objective perception to the most insignificant objects and set up a lasting monument of their objectivity and spiritual peace in paintings of still life. The aesthetic beholder does not contemplate this without emotions, for it graphically describes to him the calm, tranquil, will-free frame of mind of which the artist which was necessary for contemplating such insignificant things so objectively, considering them so attentively, and repeating this perception with such thought. Since the picture invites the beholder to participate in this state, his emotion is often enhanced by the contrast between it and his own restless state of mind, disturbed by vehement willing, in which he happens to be. In the same spirit, landscape painters, especially Ruysdael, have often painted extremely insignificant landscape objects and have thus produced the same effect even more delightfully." End quote. And so it's almost as if he's trying to describe the most boring type of art possible. Now, I'm not knocking still life paintings, nor am I knocking a landscape painting of an insignificant landscape, as he puts it. I like paintings of simple and small things, but something about the way he describes it is just so contrary to what I find intriguing about art. It's like he thinks the relevant thing about a piece of art is whether one can get into the mind state of the kind of care and attention to something so neutral and insignificant. And so art for Schopenhauer is about becoming that mirror where you are completely reflecting the objectivity of something. So I think that would be the most generous way to put it. Maybe some artists out there will maybe understand that. But in any case, as a meditative exercise, as a very specific way to engage with art, I think it's worth considering. And so In any case, this is where Schopenhauer brings in the concept of genius. Genius, of course, shares an etymological root with the word genie in English, or that's jinn in Arabic. And so we use the term genius for someone who has breakthrough insights that seemingly come out of nowhere, just like the power of the genie seemingly comes out of nowhere and works as if by magic. In Schopenhauer's conception of genius, the genius is the person who is capable of comprehending the ideas, the Platonic ideas, independently of the individual entities of that idea. The genius is the ability for representing the idea itself without the plurality and the impermanence and strife caused by being subject to the principle of sufficient reason, like all the individuated phenomena of an idea are. And thus the person with genius is capable of becoming this pure, will-less subject of knowing. And so the degree to which genius, genius is in the common parlance is perceived to come from outside the subject. Someone has a light bulb moment. Where does it come from? This folk wisdom is because genius is, it's experienced as something. It's experienced as like pure knowing in the moment of genius, and you don't know where it came from. Schopenhauer's explanation for this is that, the true genius is empty of their own individuated will in their moment of genius. And he also says this is why madness and the arts are always correlated. And in Schopenhauer's explanation, it's because, quote, the impression of the present moment on them is very strong and carries them away into thoughtless actions, into emotion and passion, end quote. That's from section 36, where he likens the madness of the artistic or philosophical genius to Plato's enlightened man who has freed himself from the cave. Quote, those who outside the cave have seen true sunlight and the things that actually are, the ideas, cannot afterwards see within the cave anymore, because their eyes have grown unaccustomed to the darkness. They no longer recognize the shadow forms correctly. They are therefore ridiculed for their mistakes by those others who have never left the cave in those shadow forms, end quote. So this is the role of the artist, and although, the term genius could be applied to anyone capable of purely absorbing themselves in the activity of the mind without their individual will becoming involved. Schopenhauer has very peculiar views on art and some unusual definitions, to say the least. But where it's most useful is in how the idea of will-less contemplation figures into his philosophy, and that is as an activity of religious importance, we might say, or of metaphysical importance. And such an encounter with aesthetic beauty that completely enraptures you in will-less contemplation is what Schopenhauer calls the sublime. Such an object of aesthetic contemplation that can put you into this state is itself sublime, he says. Thus we have a definition of beauty that comes along with Schopenhauer's aesthetics, which he finds in the sublime, and he can therefore hold up as the teleological end of all artistic activity. Schopenhauer's theory of aesthetics also includes natural beauty as well as man-made, and he writes extensively about how the natural world can call you into the world of the sublime. And he writes in section 39, quote, let us transport ourselves to a very, very lonely region of boundless horizons, under a perfectly cloudless sky, trees and plants and the perfectly motionless air, no animals, no human beings, no moving masses of water, the profoundest silence. Such surroundings are, as it were, a summons to seriousness, to contemplation, with complete emancipation from all willing and its cravings. But it is just this that gives to such a scene of mere solitude and profound peace a touch of the sublime. End quote. This is why Schopenhauer is sometimes classed as a romantic. Romanticism is one of those funny words because it means a bunch of different things, some of which are contradictory. But I think this is because we usually judge romanticism by the resultant attitude created by a given philosophy. So like the result, right, the effect, rather than the cause. So less on the rigorous analysis of a given philosophy's tenets. Schopenhauer produced a philosophy in which the immersion in nature is synonymous with finding peace and absorption into pure contemplation of the object. And so he's by that token romantic, because he's literally saying the way to salvation from the striving and strife of the world is through the feelings that nature stirs in us. So Schopenhauer has, of course, been called by far scarier names than that of a romantic, though. He's been called the great pessimist. And I want to get into why one of the most pessimistic aspects of Schopenhauer's philosophy. It's one that sets him apart. Unlike some pessimists such as Ligotti or Cioran or David Benatar, Schopenhauer does not see man's mortality as the central depressing fact of his existence, because Schopenhauer is in some sense actually darker than that. For Schopenhauer, if death was merely the end of our existence, that would be a form of salvation from the endless suffering of the world in and of itself, right? But Schopenhauer doesn't believe that we escape this samsara of willing merely through dying. I'm not trying to trivialize those other pessimists, by the way. The horror and pain in Cioran, for example. His work is a very poetic attempt to confront the void at the end of consciousness. For Ligotti, the knowledge of time and our mortality is, again, the central problem. For Schopenhauer, however, the problem does not end with the death of any individual phenomenon of the will. Our concern with the problem doesn't even end with our own death. For Schopenhauer, the problem is not death. The problem is life. Life is suffering. The world is the will to live in its various incarnate forms, an endless push to continue to exist in whatever state you're in, every individual pattern in its little states, forever willing and never having satisfaction, and never succeeding. And an end to this cycle of suffering is exactly what Schopenhauer thinks we must find through philosophy and aesthetics and ascetic practice, which means he's in lockstep again with the Buddhists here, who don't believe there is an easy way out of samsara by dying, because of the doctrine of rebirth. And I have so much to say on this that I can't elaborate further without derailing the episode, but I'll just say it's very telling that the Western secular Buddhists that we have here in America, when they convert, they don't typically want to accept the idea of rebirth when they convert to Buddhism, even though rebirth is more or less a universal in the beliefs of Buddhists all over the world. And yet here, American Buddhists are always quick to tell you it's something you don't, quote, have to believe. And of course we don't want to believe that, because American Buddhists are looking for, they're looking for a way out of their suffering, and recharacterizing existence itself as this truly inescapable suffering, I think, would be too demoralizing. But so Schopenhauer begins book 4 by addressing mortality, and he points out how our concern with mortality has driven mankind in every civilization to adopt complex, sometimes costly rituals and representations associated with death. He particularly praises the Hindu conception of the Godhead's Trinity, which includes Brahma, who symbolizes generation, Vishnu, who symbolizes preservation, and Shiva, who symbolizes destruction, appearing as he does with the necklace of skulls and the lingam. But he also notes the costly Roman sarcophagi. We could also include all the holidays of death that we talked about in the Halloween episode we did recently. But so Schopenhauer writes in section 54, quote, "The form of this phenomenon is time, space, and causality, and through these, individuation, which requires that the individual must come into being and pass away. But this no more disturbs the will to live, the individual being only a particular example or specimen, so to speak, of this phenomenon of will, than does the death of an individual injure the whole of nature. For it is not the individual that nature cares for, but only the species. And in all seriousness, she urges the preservation of the species, since she provides so lavishly through the immense surplus of the seed and the great strength of the fructifying impulse. The individual, on the contrary, has no value to nature, and can have none, for finite time, infinite space, and the infinite number of possible individuals therein are her kingdom. Therefore, nature is always ready to let the individual fall, and the individual is accordingly not only exposed to destruction in 1,000 ways from the most insignificant accidents, but is even destined for this and is led towards it by nature herself from the moment that individual has served the maintenance of the species. In this way, nature quite openly expresses the great truth that only ideas, not individuals, have reality proper. In other words, are a complete objectivity of the will. End quote. So Schopenhauer mentions Shiva, as I said before. But this depiction of nature using, female pronouns for nature, as he does throughout the passage we just quoted, it reminds me a great deal of Kali, Shiva's wife, or really any depictions of the monstrous feminine, or the many underworld goddesses of ancient times. Schopenhauer is basically hammering home that as individuals living as part of this phenomenal world, we're subject to these laws of causality and individuation and thus mortality. We're not like the Platonic ideas, and that means they're more real than we ever can be, even though individual human beings have their own special archetype. But that archetype, that pattern of you, in theory, is even more real than you are as a willing subject. Because the willing subject that exists as an individual thing, strives after other objectified individual things in the world, and that thing will die, and that's unavoidable. But here we have to remember these two worlds that Schopenhauer is standing in, because on the one hand, all being is indivisible and eternally indestructible, and on the other hand, being exists as all these individual things that are constantly being recycled. Part of his argument, as to how you can deny the will to live is part of what you're doing is recognizing that eternal indestructibility of being and reflecting it, simply like a mirror. And so Schopenhauer, he goes on to argue that it's irrational to fear death because it's only if one fully embraces life and is satisfied with life as it is that you can fear for the end of life. But Schopenhauer thinks that's a delusional attitude, and he thinks it's one that your life will eventually disabuse you of. That would be the short argument. But he writes in section 54 of man's paradoxical attitude towards death, which I find very fascinating. Quote, "Everything is entirely in nature, and she is entirely in everything. She has her center in every animal. The animal has certainly found its way into existence, just as it will certainly find its way out of it. Meanwhile, it lives fearlessly and heedlessly in the presence of annihilation, supported by the consciousness that it is nature herself and is as imperishable as she. Man alone carries with him, in abstract concepts, the certainty of his own death, yet this can frighten him only very rarely and at particular moments when some occasion calls it up to the imagination. Against the mighty voice of nature, reflection can do little. In man, as in the animal that does not think, there prevails a lasting state of mind, that certainty, springing from innermost consciousness, that he is nature, the world itself. By virtue of this, no one is noticeably disturbed by the thought of certain and never distant death, but everyone lives on as though he is bound to live forever." End quote. And so that's curious to me. It's very intuitive to me in some sense, and yet it flies in the face of the common wisdom that the fear of death is this universal and pervasive influential force in the human psyche. Schopenhauer suggests here that we don't in common practice find ourselves bothered by death, that the nature of existence is essentially for the individual will to focus its attention just on its immediate goals and desires and go on striving that way as though it was going to continue forever. And his explanation for this is that deep down we have an immediate knowledge that we're all part and parcel with the will, and nothing is really going to end when we go into death. Our conceptual and religious frameworks for dealing with death are these mere abstract concepts. It's a way to put those thoughts off in a box so we can continue laboring in the service of the will. The individual phenomenon dies, but it was an unreal, dreamlike phantasm anyway. And many religions have this idea that in death you're returning to this primordial unity. or in modern Christianity, returning to your communion with God, however you want to put it. It becomes a little difficult at this point to explain what Schopenhauer thinks happens after death. And on some level, you might ask, what is he, an expert? Why is he speaking about this? But except to say he thinks of things, basically, I guess, following his epistemology through to its logical conclusions, he thinks that speaking of things happening, quote unquote, after death is like a category confusion almost. So we exist temporally while we're representing the world, right? Because time is a function or an aspect of the world as representation. But he believes that, if we're talking about time when the representation stops, by definition, all we are is the thing in itself. We would return to the thing in itself, which continues on in its blind striving. And he quotes the Vedas here in his footnotes, a section where it apparently says that when a man dies, his various sense faculties become one with the various things of the world. His visual faculty becomes one with the sun, his sense of smell with the earth, his hearing with the air, his speech with fire, and so on. This is not supposed to be taken literally, but Schopenhauer sees a lot of these ancient writings as prefiguring more sophisticated logical insights that would come later. And so he holds to Plato's idea that learning is remembering, that we recall these eternal insights into the nature of things, perhaps through genius, you might say. And so men throughout time have had the insight that death is not, quote unquote, the end, but it's difficult to express because by exiting our consciousness and not representing the world anymore, you don't go somewhere else after death. We cease to exist as separate things in space and time, but go on as part of the indestructible chain of being. So perhaps there's not really like a language to talk about this. So he writes in section 54, quote, "For it is true that everyone is transitory only as phenomenon, but on the other hand, as thing in itself, he is timeless, and so endless. But also, only as phenomenon is the individual different from the other things of the world. As thing in itself, he is the will that appears in everything, and death does away with the illusion that separates his consciousness from that of the rest. This is future existence or immortality," end quote. So it's on this account that Schopenhauer doesn't think that we might find a solution to the problem of life through, say, suicide. Life is the character of the will to live. It will go on living. It doesn't matter to the will what fleeting dreamlike forms decide to end themselves, whether they live or pass away. None of that has any bearing on the world as will. In his essay, The Indestructibility of Being, Schopenhauer clarifies a little that he doesn't believe in rebirth in the sense of one soul going on into new incarnations. He takes a view which I would call a little bit more authentically Buddhist than that, actually, which he classifies as Palingenesis, and he writes is, quote, "The decomposition and reconstruction of the individual in which will alone persists, and assuming the shape of a new being receives a new intellect," end quote. So that's very similar, again, to the Buddhist picture of samsara, and the way that works is chitta, the mind stream, or the particular vector, you might say, of one's will or desire or ego continually takes on new shapes in accord with its past karma, so long as that karma is not exhausted. So it's not reincarnation in the sense that your soul dies and then like you or your individuality, some kind of like individual soul transmigrates from thing to thing. It's on a more fundamental level than that. How would I put it? Without getting too new agey, the best way to say it is Schopenhauer really does believe you contain the whole universe, and the whole universe is you. And the part that's not new agey is that it's a suffering, tortured universe, and ending the one individual life will not end its suffering. But, again, as he says above, the distinctions between you and everything else are an illusion. And so, again, this is kind of almost beyond language to talk about, but And so Schopenhauer distinguishes the evils of death and pain from one another. Death is the fear of the termination of one's individual existence. And so the individual, it's in its nature to, as the will to live, it struggles with all its might against death. But for Schopenhauer, he thinks we can dispel that kind of fear through reason by understanding the true substance of the world, that which we are. That true substance cannot die. Our individual existence is this an illusion that will dissolve one day, but that won't kill you in any real sense. So for Schopenhauer, the real evil between the two that he distinguishes is pain. The real problem to deal with is not death, but the fact that life goes on endlessly, and life is endless pain. And so he concludes these considerations in section 54, laying this out clearly for us by way of example. Quote, "A man who had assimilated firmly into his way of thinking the truths so far advanced, but at the same time had not come to know through his own experience or through a deeper insight that constant suffering is essential to all life, who found satisfaction in life and took perfect delight in it, who desired, in spite of calm deliberation, that the course of his life as he had hitherto experienced it should be of endless duration or of constant recurrence, and whose courage to face life was so great that, in return for life's pleasures, he would willingly and gladly put up with all the hardships and miseries to which it is subject. Such a man would stand, quote, with firm, strong bones in the well-grounded and enduring earth, and would have nothing to fear. Armed with the knowledge we confer on him, he would look with indifference at death hastening toward him on the wings of time. He would consider it as a false illusion, an impotent specter, frightening to the weak, but having no power over him who knows that he himself is that will, of which the whole world is the objectification or copy, to which therefore life and also the present always remain certain and sure." End quote. So I know I said we're saving Nietzsche's interpretations and modifications of Schopenhauer for future episodes, but hearing that, that should ring some bells for you, right? The idea of somebody wishing for constant recurrence of their life. The thought of death is, that's frightening to the weak, but not someone certain of their ever-enduring life and existence, and the fact that they are really the will. This to me almost reads like a challenge that Nietzsche accepted. Schopenhauer is setting up this type of person. Now, for Schopenhauer's purposes, he's setting this up as the preliminary stage in an argument in which he goes on to argue that life is irredeemable by any pleasures that occur within it, because the evil isn't death, it's pain. And Schopenhauer is only using this example of such a person just simply to say, to point out that it's their lack of understanding of the cruel, pointless nature of life that would make them take such a position. Such a person, as he describes them, would be entirely correct about the nature of the world. Being solely will, and this indestructible primal being, death is of no consequence. But to Schopenhauer, they would simply be wrong about life. It is life and the will to live which must be rejected, denied, and negated. And so if we accept Schopenhauer's picture of the world, then Nietzsche's disagreement with him would not be about the facts on the ground, so to speak. It's that Nietzsche is willing to say yes to that life that Schopenhauer just outlined. He's willing to posit that eternal recurrence as a positive thing. And so he does not wish to negate the will and negate the world as Schopenhauer does, and we'll elaborate on that in following episodes. But Schopenhauer believes that such a viewpoint is not reasonable. And the strongest argument he has for that is the argument that, simply put, pleasure is not happiness, or at least it's not sufficient for happiness. To Schopenhauer, happiness can only be meaningfully defined as the absence of what we would call suffering. Not just physical pain, but suffering in the sense of mental anguish. Again, remember, only humans truly can suffer in the sense that we would understand suffering. And the absence of this suffering is happiness, as he defines it. Pleasure has nothing to do with it. In actual fact, pursuing pleasures is necessarily detrimental to happiness in Schopenhauer's view. That's central to what the problem is, right? And so he writes in 58, and I'm quoting here in an abridged form, where I'll be skipping down through a couple sections. He writes, quote, "All satisfaction, or what is commonly called happiness, is really and essentially always negative only and never positive. For desire, that is to say, want, is the precedent condition of every pleasure, and so the satisfaction or gratification can never be more than deliverance from a pain or a want. Such is not only every actual and evident suffering, but also every desire whose importunity disturbs our peace, and indeed even the deadening boredom that makes existence a burden to us. The want, the privation, the suffering is what is positive, and proclaims itself immediately." End quote. And what we have here is, it's fascinating to me because it's so Platonic in a sense, while also being very anti-Platonic in another sense. It's a rejection of the concept of the good life, because life is, by definition, not good. And yet Schopenhauer does have a sort of eudaimonia he's pointing to here. It's just that it's achieved by the negation of the individual will and the voluntary abandonment of the pursuits of life's aims. Because there's nothing to be gained. If happiness is negative and merely the absence of suffering, and suffering is actually what it is that asserts itself, it asserts itself repeatedly through the movement of the endlessly striving will, then the moral and reasonable thing to do in that case is to act negatively, to deny oneself their endless chasing after their own desires. And so Schopenhauer's other prescriptions, other than the contemplation of art and asceticism, are quiet contemplation, living simply, and following your desires as little as possible. And so walking out of Plato's cave involves this rejection of the world as a mere illusion, a life lived for knowledge and knowing as a thing detached from life and the will. And so what then is the aim of Schopenhauer's Metaphysics and Morality? Where does it all lead? Where does one's life lead if lived not for any goal or object of one's will? If one's only desire is to negate desire, to negate suffering, negate the will. The will, of course, being the world. So what is left then? And Schopenhauer's answer is nothing. Schopenhauer's aim is the equivalent of the Buddhist concept of prajna paramita, the perfection of wisdom, which is it's the negation of the subject-object dualism. By definition, this state of being is impossible for us to fully encompass in language, as beings trapped within these individuated willing existences, as we already said. But Schopenhauer even rejects the conceptual frameworks that he discovered in the East and that inspired him so much. At the very end of the work, he writes in section 71, quote, "That we abhor nothingness so much is simply another way of saying that we will life so much, and that we are nothing but this will, and know nothing but it alone." End quote. When this denial of will is achieved, in the tradition of the saints of every religion, we step aside from this restless pressure and effort and stop partaking in the constant transition from desire to apprehension, from joy to sorrow. We contemplate the forms of the world, but do not invest them with substance, which is a process done by our desires. And so Schopenhauer continues, quote, "We have to banish that dark impression of nothingness, which as the final goal hovers behind all virtue and holiness, and which we fear as children fear darkness. We must not even evade it, as the Indians do, by myths and meaningless words, such as reabsorption in Brahman, or the nirvana of the Buddhists. On the contrary, we freely acknowledge that what remains after the complete abolition of the will is, for all who are still full of the will, assuredly nothing. But also, conversely, to those in whom the will has turned and denied itself, This very real world of ours, with all its suns and galaxies, is nothing. End quote. Sometimes scholars in the West have translated nirvana as extinction. Perhaps a more proper term is extinguishment. I've heard some figures such as Peacock and Batchelor criticize these translations and, critique the fact that the West was introduced to Eastern religion through the pessimism of Schopenhauer. But I think it's fair to say that Schopenhauer here, even, he's distinguishing himself from his Eastern influences, and that he's willing to be, I wouldn't say more pessimistic, but he's saying we shouldn't even have a linguistic term for this state of being, because that just gives people the impression it's our way of hiding from the fact of looking honestly at the fact that the salvation is the void. That's what he says, hovers behind all attempts at holiness and virtue, is the promise of nothingness. Psychologically, you could have a field day wondering about whether that's actually true or says more about Schopenhauer than everyone else. But, no likening of the state of one in nirvana to some kind of continued existence. No mystifying of the fact of the state of being that we're aiming towards. Full acceptance that rejection of the world means true nothingness. So true death for Schopenhauer isn't something achieved through suicide. He calls suicide vain and a useless gesture, because the will continue incarnating and you'll still be part of that. True death is found in the conscious, rational rejection of life as a sort of autonomous choice of the willing subject. True nothingness is achieved as an act of the intellect, an act of pure knowledge, pure perception. And thus, even though, he writes elsewhere that it would have been better if there were no existence at all, as with the quote that we started the episode with, his attitude is ultimately more nuanced than that, and that the world as he sees it, the way it actually is, human life is the opportunity to find freedom. And that's as a consequence of humanity reaching this point of being able to represent the suffering of the world fully. And freedom from that world is synonymous with nothingness. And so there we have it. There is your introduction to Schopenhauer. So that next week, when we get into Nietzsche and his works drawing on Schopenhauer, you will already know about concepts such as will, representation, genius, the sublime, the pure will-less subject of knowledge, the bright mirror of the artist's perception, negation of the will, happiness as a negative principle, the redemptive power of nature, and so on and so forth. Which, all of those things that I just belted off before listening to this, if you'd never read Schopenhauer, that would have sounded like a bunch of nonsense, but hopefully all those terms now fire neurons for you. And so from there, we can begin to show how Nietzsche took this picture of the world as will and was heavily influenced by it, and how he was intrigued by this idea of feeling, drive, desire as the root of all life. He was perplexed by Schopenhauer's demonic conclusions about the nature of reality. And Nietzsche wrote about how his own romantic impulses spoke so differently to him. But, it's my belief personally, I think the ideas of Schopenhauer's, which are but little discussed, probably had a greater impact on Nietzsche, or kind of underrated. Things like Schopenhauer's view on art, his view of history as simply an endlessly repeating cycle that progresses nowhere. Because to him, reality only exists in the present, and the true, geniuses, quote unquote, were motivated by genius, as he sees it, as this eternal remembering of direct perception of this eternal knowledge. And so that can happen anywhere, anytime. It's not a process of progress. And finally, this notion of the eternal indestructibility of being, which I think provided the groundwork for Nietzsche, among many other influences that he had, to begin thinking about the eternal recurrence. All right, well, thank you, everybody, for taking a trip down to the underworld with me. We'll be back next week to talk about another essay from the Untimely Meditations, which is Schopenhauer as Educator. All right, signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.